At 7 in the morning, my phone lit up with a text message from my son that shattered a 3-year dream. Plans changed. You are not coming on the cruise. Nicole wants only her family. This was a spiritual journey to the African diaspora I had meticulously planned and paid $55,000 for. I did not text back. I simply opened my banking app, canceled the payments, sold my house, and left town. When he returned, the house he thought he was inheriting looked like a war zone. My name is Tyrone. I am 68 years old, a retired master electrician and commercial contractor. For 35 years, I thought I was raising a son who understood the value of hard work, respect, and family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a permanent lesson. The morning light crept through the heavy oak blinds of my bedroom in the Chicago suburbs. I stood beside my bed, folding a stack of linen shirts into my vintage leather suitcase. This suitcase had traveled with me through decades of grueling contract work. Now it was supposed to carry my belongings across the Atlantic. The sudden vibration of my phone on the mahogany nightstand shattered the quiet. I wiped my calloused hands on my slacks and picked it up. It was the text from Corey. The words were a cold, calculated strike. He told me the plans had changed. He said I was no longer joining the Heritage Cruise. He claimed his wife Nicole wanted an intimate experience with just her side of the family. There was no apology. There was no explanation. Just a blunt dismissal from a journey I had spent 3 years researching and funding. This trip was meant to be a spiritual return to the African diaspora, a pilgrimage I intended to share with my only child to honor our ancestors. Instead, it became the exact moment my son severed our bond. I stared at the screen. 40 years of sweat of wiring commercial high-rises in the freezing winter to pay for his college education dissolved in 2 sentences. I did not type a response. I did not call him to demand an explanation. Arguing with a man who has already rationalized his betrayal is a complete waste of breath. I placed the phone back on the nightstand. The sharp sting of rejection slowly hardened into a terrifying clarity. My son had made his choice. Now I had to make mine. I reached for my tablet resting on the dresser and opened my primary banking application. Trust is a beautiful concept, but verification is the foundation of survival. I navigated to the shared travel fund account. The screen loaded, displaying a reality far more malicious than a simple change of vacation plans. A cleared charge of $55,000 sat at the top of the ledger. That was the cost of the luxury suite I had booked for us. But the transactions did not stop there. Scrolling further down, a cluster of pending charges caught my eye. There was an unauthorized deduction of $4,000 for VIP port excursions. I tapped the transaction details. The reservations were explicitly booked under the names of Nicole's parents. My son and his wife had not simply uninvited me. They had stolen my financial information to upgrade her family vacation using my hard-earned money. Nicole had always carried a subtle air of entitlement, treating my home and my resources as if they were her birthright. I had tolerated her thinly veiled microaggressions to keep the peace with Corey. I had overlooked her snide remarks about my working-class background because I wanted my son to have a happy marriage. This was different. This was blatant, calculated exploitation. They intended to sail across the ocean on my dime while leaving me sitting alone in the house I built from the ground up. The financial theft transformed my heartbreak into a cold, methodical rage. A son who steals from his father is no longer a son. He is a liability. The conflict was no longer about a ruined vacation. It was about dismantling a parasite. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to the bank fraud department. An automated voice prompted me to enter my security PIN. I pressed the digits with absolute precision. When the fraud specialist answered, I did not raise my voice or show a fraction of the anger burning in my chest. I calmly identified myself and provided my master account credentials. I instructed the specialist to immediately flag the $4,000 in excursion charges as fraudulent and unauthorized. Then I targeted the root of the issue. I initiated a hard, irrevocable chargeback on the entire $55,000 cruise package. The specialist warned me that doing so would instantly invalidate the booking with the cruise line. I told her that was exactly the point. The luxury suite, the priority boarding, the premium dining packages. I burned it all to the ground with a single verbal authorization, but I did not stop there. 5 years ago, I had established a joint legacy account for Corey, intending to give him a financial safety net for his future children. I had deposited $10,000 a year into that account. I instructed the bank to freeze the legacy fund entirely and strip Corey of his signatory rights. Every financial bridge I had built for him was now demolished. The operator processed the requests, her keyboard clacking rapidly through the phone speaker. With every keystroke, a thread of my son's comfortable, unearned lifestyle snapped. The transfer of power was complete. I thanked the specialist and ended the call. The trap was officially set. Less than 10 minutes later, the absolute silence of my bedroom was violently interrupted. My phone began to ring. The caller identification flashed Corey's name in bright, demanding letters. The ringtone echoed off the bedroom walls, loud and frantic. I knew exactly where he was. He was standing at the cruise terminal check-in desk, staring at a declined boarding pass. The booking portal had undoubtedly locked him out, demanding immediate payment for a $55,000 balance he absolutely could not cover. He called again. And then a third time. I could picture his panic. I could picture Nicole's furious face as the terminal staff pulled them out of the priority boarding line. My son was currently realizing that the man he thought he could discard like garbage held the keys to his entire existence. I did not answer the phone. I let it ring until it rolled to voicemail. I walked back to my bed and looked down at my open vintage suitcase. I neatly folded my last linen shirt and placed it inside. I grasped the heavy brass zippers and pulled them closed. The metallic sound was the final period at the end of our relationship. I had spent my entire life building and providing. Now I was going to teach Corey what happens when the foundation is pulled out from under him. The silent adjustment had begun. The cancellation of the cruise was merely the first countermeasure. I needed the original deed to the house to sever my final financial tie to my son. I walked down the heavy oak stairs to the basement. I had framed and finished this entire lower level 40 years ago with my own hands. My wall safe sat concealed behind a false panel near the utility room. As I reached for the panel, my boot brushed against something metallic beneath a heavy canvas drop cloth. I pulled the tarp back. A contractor's aluminum clipboard lay resting on a stack of commercial drywall. I did not hire any contractors. I picked up the clipboard. The top page was a detailed work order from a local retrofitting company. The itemized list included reinforced steel door frames, heavy-duty deadbolts, and industrial soundproofing materials. My eyes scanned the dimensions. These were not materials used for a standard home renovation. These were the exact specifications required for institutional containment. My decades in commercial contracting made the reality of the list undeniable. Someone was preparing to turn a section of my home into a holding cell. I flipped to the second page of the work order. The billing address matched Corey and Nicole's apartment. The commencement date for the demolition was scheduled for the exact Monday I was supposed to be halfway across the Atlantic Ocean. They waited until they thought I was safely out of the country to begin tearing apart my foundation. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. The financial theft was no longer the primary issue. I needed to understand exactly what they intended to build inside my house. I turned to the third page attached to the clipboard. It was a set of architectural blueprints drafted specifically for my basement. The plans detailed the conversion of my lower guest suite into an isolated medical room. The design featured an exterior lock system on a reinforced steel door. The interior windows were marked for permanent sealing with plexiglass panels. A space was designated for a mechanized hospital bed. At the bottom of the schematic, the client authorization signature was clearly visible. It belonged to Nicole. The jagged cursive letters confirmed her direct involvement. The strategy became crystal clear. Corey and Nicole planned to move her parents into the primary floors of my house while I was on the cruise. Upon my return, they would not allow me back into my own master bedroom. They intended to force me into this basement containment unit. I had seen this tactic before during my years working on nursing home construction projects. Families would trap their elderly relatives in isolated wings to control their assets while occupying the main estate. Nicole wanted the luxury of my 4-bedroom home for her family, and Corey lacked the spine to stop her. He had traded his father's freedom for his wife's comfort. They intended to strip away my autonomy and lock me in the dark. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They saw my age as an opportunity to discard me. I placed the blueprints back onto the stack of drywall. I did not feel sorrow. I felt the absolute icy resolve of a man preparing for war. They assumed I was an obsolete old man. They forgot I was the master contractor who built the walls they planned to use against me. Beneath the clipboard rested a thick manila folder. The label bore my full legal name. I opened the flap and extracted a multi-page medical document. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation from a private clinic across town. I had never visited this clinic. I had not seen a psychiatrist in my entire life. I read the diagnostic summary printed on the heavy bond paper. The evaluating physician claimed I suffered from advanced dementia and severe cognitive decline. The report detailed fabricated incidents of me wandering the neighborhood, forgetting my own name, and becoming violently aggressive toward my family. It explicitly recommended immediate restricted confinement for my own safety. Corey had forged a complete medical history to legally justify locking me in the basement. He needed this piece of paper to process the financial guardianship he had applied for earlier that week. With this document, my son could walk into any courtroom and have my fundamental human rights stripped away. The threat had escalated far beyond stolen vacation funds. This was a calculated assassination of my personal liberty. Corey and Nicole had constructed a flawless legal trap to erase me from society. If I confronted them without a plan, they would simply present this evaluation to the police and claim I was having a paranoid episode. They would use my anger as proof of my supposed insanity. I carefully placed the medical evaluation into my pocket. I approached the false panel on the wall and opened my safe. I extracted the original property deed and my passport. The house was no longer a home. It was a weapon they planned to use against me. The only way to disarm them was to completely destroy the battlefield. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my private contact list. I bypassed my family members and located a number I had not dialed in 3 years. I pressed the call button for Omar. Omar was a ruthless commercial real estate developer I had collaborated with during my time in the trade. He dealt exclusively in unencumbered cash and absolute discretion. He did not ask questions, and he moved with aggressive speed. Omar answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him I was liquidating my entire suburban estate. I offered him the property, the land, and every fixture inside the house at 20% below the current market value. The only condition was a mandatory irrevocable cash closing within 24 hours. Omar paused. He knew the pristine condition of my property. He knew the quality of the commercial-grade copper wiring and reinforced framing I had installed. The massive discount guaranteed him an immediate return on investment. I informed him that the deed was in my hand and completely clear of any legitimate liens. Omar agreed to the terms without hesitation. He promised to arrive at my front door with his legal team and a certified cashier's check within the hour. I hung up the phone. I looked around the basement I had excavated and finished with my own sweat. Corey and Nicole wanted to use my life's work as my prison. I was going to sell the prison right out from under them. I walked up the stairs, leaving the heavy drop cloth and the contractor's clipboard exactly where I found them. The trap was disarmed. The counterstrike was officially in motion. Omar pulled his black luxury utility vehicle into the driveway exactly 45 minutes after my call. He stepped out wearing a sharp charcoal suit that contrasted heavily with the dust of the construction sites he usually haunted. Omar was a man of few words and decisive action. I met him at the front door and led him straight into the house. He did not care about the custom crown molding or the imported Italian tile in the kitchen. He cared about the structural bones of the building. I took him down to the basement. I showed him the exposed utility room. I pointed out the commercial-grade copper wiring I had installed myself decades ago. I showed him the reinforced steel joists that ensured the main floor would never sag. Omar ran his hand along the foundational pillars. He recognized the meticulous craftsmanship of a master electrician and commercial builder. He knew this house could be stripped to the studs and flipped for double its market value, or demolished to build a lucrative multifamily unit. I handed him the original deed I had pulled from my safe. I reiterated my uncompromising terms. I required a cash purchase at 20% below market appraisal with a closing window of less than 24 hours. Omar calculated the profit margin in his head within seconds. The massive discount eliminated any need for negotiation. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and tapped it against his palm. He agreed to the terms immediately. He stepped outside to the patio to call his legal and financial team to initiate the expedited transfer. The swiftness of the transaction brought a fleeting sense of relief. That relief evaporated the moment Omar walked back inside with a grim expression on his face. Omar placed his phone face down on the granite kitchen island. He looked at me with a hardened professional gaze. His financial team had just completed a preliminary title search to clear the deed for the rapid cash transfer. They hit an immediate blockade. Omar informed me that an active secondary lien was firmly attached to the property. It was a home equity line of credit drawn against the total value of the estate. The outstanding balance was exactly $200,000. I stood frozen in the center of my kitchen. I had paid off the original mortgage on this property 22 years ago. I detested debt. I never carried balances on my credit cards, let alone borrowed money against the roof over my head. I asked Omar for the specific details of the loan. He checked the digital report his legal team had just emailed him. The line of credit was originated 8 months prior. The funds had been entirely exhausted over a rapid period of 90 days. Omar stated flatly that his title insurance company would not authorize a cash purchase until the encumbrance was completely satisfied. A clouded title meant the rapid closing was legally impossible. The aggressive timeline I needed to execute my exit before my son departed on the cruise was suddenly in jeopardy. I asked to see the name of the authorizing bank on the report. Omar handed me his phone. I recognized the financial institution immediately. It was the exact regional bank where Corey worked as a mid-level finance manager. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with devastating precision. My son had not only planned to lock me in a basement cell to steal my house, he had already bled the equity dry. Corey had clearly used his managerial position at the bank and his access to my personal documents to forge my signature on the loan application. He bypassed the standard income verification protocols by manipulating his internal corporate network. I remembered his constant complaints earlier that year about his failing technology startup. I remembered the immense pressure he faced to maintain Nicole's lavish spending habits. He had secretly weaponized the equity of my home to fund his bankrupt business and his wife's superficial lifestyle. The magnitude of his deceit was staggering. If I disputed the fraudulent loan through standard legal channels, the bank would freeze the property indefinitely pending a lengthy federal investigation. That process would take months. I did not have months. I had less than 24 hours before Corey and Nicole boarded that luxury ship. I needed this sale to close today. I excused myself and walked into my private study. I opened the encrypted financial application on my secure tablet. Decades ago, I had sold my first contracting firm and deposited the heavy profits into a private single-signer offshore trust. It was a silent emergency reserve, completely immune to domestic banking delays. I initiated a direct wire transfer of $200,000 straight to the regional bank holding the fraudulent lien. I authorized the immediate and total payoff of the home equity line of credit. The offshore funds moved instantaneously, clearing the fabricated debt and releasing the property title. The financial sacrifice was substantial, but the cost of inaction was my permanent imprisonment. Paying off my son's stolen debt did not weaken my resolve. It forged my fury into an unbreakable weapon. I walked back into the kitchen and informed Omar the title was clear. Omar refreshed the legal database on his phone. His attorney confirmed the immediate release of the lien. The speed of the massive cash transaction earned a nod of absolute respect from the commercial developer. Omar pulled the final cash transfer and property relinquishment documents from his leather briefcase. He laid them out meticulously across the kitchen island. I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed every page with a steady hand, legally transferring 40 years of personal history, memory, and equity to a commercial corporate entity. The transaction was finalized instantly. The heavy sum of the purchase price was routed directly to my secure offshore trust. Omar collected the paperwork and asked when his cruise could take physical possession of the estate. I checked the cruise itinerary saved on my tablet. Corey and Nicole were scheduled to pass through the terminal security gates and board the ship exactly at noon on Friday. I gave Omar the green light. I instructed him to have his heavy demolition team arrive at the property at exactly 12 o'clock on Friday. I authorized him to begin dismantling the structure the second the clock struck the hour. Omar smiled a cold, businesslike smile. He appreciated the aggressive timeline and the absolute finality of the request. He made a quick phone call to his lead foreman, securing the heavy machinery and the tear-down permits. The scheduling was locked in. My son and his wife would be standing in a luxury terminal sipping champagne and waiting to sail away on my money. At that exact moment, excavators would tear the roof off the home they intended to steal. I walked Omar to his vehicle and shook his hand. The trap was officially armed. I had just taped the last cardboard box shut when the motion sensor alert chimed on my phone. The front porch camera displayed Corey standing on the welcome mat. He shifted his weight from side to side, looking at his luxury watch. He was conducting a surveillance check to guarantee I was quietly accepting my exile. I had exactly 40 seconds before he used his spare key to enter. I dragged the heavy moving boxes across the hardwood floor and shoved them into the deep walk-in pantry. I locked the pantry door and slid my vintage suitcase into the hall closet. I smoothed the front of my shirt and opened the front door just as his key slid into the lock. Corey stumbled forward, surprised by my sudden appearance. I looked at him with an absolutely blank expression. I did not show anger. I did not show grief. I invited him inside and offered him a cup of coffee. He walked into the living room, scanning the space for any signs of a tantrum. He expected to find a broken old man nursing a bruised ego. Instead, he found a pristine house and a father pouring dark roast coffee with a steady hand. He took a seat on the leather sofa, visibly relaxing when he realized I was not packing a bag for the airport. He believed his trap was perfectly concealed. He thought he had successfully manipulated the board. He did not realize he was sitting in a house that technically belonged to a commercial developer. I handed him the ceramic mug and sat in the armchair opposite him. I waited for him to speak first. Silence is a mirror that forces a liar to look at his own reflection. Corey cleared his throat and launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue. He lowered his eyes, adopting the posture of a deeply burdened husband. He told me the cruise cancellation had absolutely nothing to do with me. He claimed Nicole was suffering from severe postpartum anxiety despite their youngest child being 4 years old. According to his narrative, her therapist mandated she be surrounded exclusively by her biological family to prevent a mental breakdown. It was a cowardly performance. He then layered a second lie over the first. He stated Nicole's father required specialized breathing equipment for the ocean air. The equipment supposedly took up the entire space in the luxury suite I had originally paid for. Corey presented himself as a helpless victim of circumstance trapped between a fragile wife and a demanding father-in-law. I listened to every word without interrupting. 30 years ago, I taught him how to wire a circuit board by tracing the current from the source to the terminal. Now I watched him construct a faulty emotional circuit right in front of my eyes. He was laying the psychological groundwork to move Nicole's parents into my house. He needed me to feel sympathetic so I would not question their sudden arrival while he was sailing the Caribbean. He finished his hollow apology by placing a hand over his heart and swearing he would make it up to me next summer. I looked at the man who shared my DNA. He was a spectacular coward. I nodded slowly, projecting absolute understanding. I told him a man must always prioritize the health of his wife above all else. The visible relief washing over his face was genuinely sickening. I stood up and walked over to the mahogany credenza near the fireplace. I opened the top drawer and retrieved a small velvet box. Inside rested a vintage gold timepiece. My own father had purchased this watch with his first union paycheck in 1960. It was the only item of real value our family possessed during those hard early years. I walked back to the sofa and placed the velvet box on the glass coffee table in front of Corey. I told him that since I could not join him on the ancestral journey, I wanted a piece of our family history to make the voyage. I presented it as a peace offering, a profound gesture of my unconditional blessing. A son with a shred of conscience would have refused the gift. A man harboring the guilt of forgery and planned imprisonment would have found the weight of that gold watch entirely unbearable. Corey did not hesitate. His eyes locked onto the gold face with predatory hunger. He snatched the box from the table and snapped it shut, sliding it smoothly into the breast pocket of his designer jacket. He thanked me profusely, completely missing the test I had just administered. The watch was a final diagnostic check of his morality. He failed instantly. His boundless greed eclipsed any lingering fragment of filial duty. He was willing to strip me of my money, my home, my freedom, and my heritage without a single moment of hesitation. I smiled warmly at him. It was the smile of a predator watching a rat step eagerly onto the spring of a steel trap. The transaction was complete. I had absolutely no remaining reservations about the destruction I was about to unleash upon his life. Corey stood up, checking his phone as a fabricated excuse to end the visit. He gave me a brief, rigid hug that felt like embracing a mannequin. He promised to send me pictures from the ship's upper deck. I told him I looked forward to seeing exactly how the trip turned out. I watched through the front window as he walked to his luxury sedan. His stride was light, bouncing with the arrogance of a man who believed he had outsmarted his elder. He drove away, leaving me alone in the silent house. I immediately grabbed my coat and exited through the back door. I drove my truck straight to the downtown financial district. My corporate fraud attorney Bradley was waiting for me in his corner office. The massive cash wire from Omar's commercial development firm had already cleared into my primary holding account. The sale of the estate was absolute. I sat across from Bradley and instructed him to execute the final protective maneuver. We moved the entire multi-million-dollar payout into a highly secure, unsearchable private trust. I structured the trust so that my name did not appear on any publicly accessible domestic registry. Corey had spent months meticulously planning to drain my assets through a fraudulent medical guardianship. By the time he walked into a courtroom with his fake psychiatric evaluation, the money he sought to steal would be a ghost. I signed the final legal transfer documents with a firm, heavy stroke of the pen. The financial firewall was locked in place. I shook Bradley's hand and walked out of the high-rise building into the crisp city air. I had successfully severed my legacy from my son. The detonation was scheduled for noon tomorrow. I sat in the high-altitude silence of the executive airport lounge, the glass wall offering a panoramic view of the bustling harbor. Below, the massive cruise ship loomed against the docks like a floating fortress. Through the powerful binoculars resting in my lap, I could see the terminal entrance. People were moving like ants in a colony, dragging designer luggage toward the promise of a luxury vacation. I checked my phone screen. The banking app displayed a real-time log of attempted authorizations from the cruise line merchant services. The cruise line was desperate to secure the final $55,000 payment before finalizing the manifests. I tapped a command on the screen to reject the authorization request. A notification popped up in crimson text stating the transaction was declined. They tried again 30 seconds later, likely thinking it was a momentary glitch in the network. I rejected it again. I sipped my black coffee, feeling no tremor in my hands. The peace was absolute. I had referenced the tactical planning techniques from Kichban-ong-daden 2_11.docx to ensure my financial footprint was erased, and the result was satisfyingly clinical. The ship was not going anywhere with passengers who did not have a cleared balance. I checked the status of the old credit card linked to the account. The system reported a hard lockout. The cruise line front office would be frantically trying to contact the cardholder, but the phone lines I had redirected were now dead air. I adjusted the focus on my binoculars and zoomed in on the VIP terminal entrance. The security guard stood at the gate checking documents against a digital tablet. The stage was set for the collapse. Down at the terminal, the atmosphere shifted from excitement to chaos. I watched Corey and Nicole through the glass. They were standing at the VIP check-in counter, their posture rigid and impatient. Nicole kept checking her watch, tapping her foot in those expensive heels she loved to show off. The check-in agent was staring at the computer screen with a confused expression. She gestured to a supervisor who leaned over and tapped a few keys on the keyboard. Corey stepped forward, his body language signaling irritation. He probably thought the delay was an insult to his status. A security officer approached the desk, his radio crackling with static. The supervisor spoke to the officer, gesturing toward Corey and Nicole. It was clear the transaction had failed for the third time, and the system had automatically flagged the booking as invalid for non-payment. Security moved into position, cordoning off the VIP lane. The crowd behind them began to murmur, the noise filtering up to the lounge even through the soundproof glass. Corey started gesturing wildly, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He was shouting now, trying to explain his social standing to the staff. But the cruise director, a man in a crisp white uniform, stepped out of the back office with a thick paper file in his hand. He approached the group, his face stern. He did not care about Corey's status or his excuses. He wanted the $55,000. He spoke to Corey, and I could see the color drain from my son's face. The cruise director pointed toward the exit, his hand indicating that they were not stepping on that ship today. The security detail stepped closer, physically separating them from the check-in queue, forcing them to retreat under the scrutiny of hundreds of embarrassed travelers. My phone erupted with a piercing, aggressive ringtone. I answered on the first ring, keeping my voice cool and flat. Corey screamed before I could even say hello. He was shouting about a bank error, demanding I wire the funds immediately because the security staff was threatening to bar them from the terminal. He claimed the bank had flagged the account due to an automated security algorithm. I listened to his frantic, breathless rambling. He was spinning lies as quickly as he could, trying to blame the system for his own lack of funds. I waited for him to pause for air. I did not offer reassurance or assistance. Instead, I asked him a single simple question. I asked him why a retired master electrician and commercial contractor would need precise industrial measurements for a reinforced basement door. The line went dead silent. The wind seemed to vanish from his sails. I followed up by asking if he had enjoyed the cost estimates he signed for the medical containment suite he and Nicole had planned. The silence from the other end was heavy, filled with the static of the terminal. I could hear his breathing change. It was no longer the sharp, angry breath of an entitled son. It was the ragged, hollow gasp of a man who realized the hunted had become the hunter. I told him I had found the clipboard, the blueprints, and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation he had meticulously filed to strip me of my rights. I spoke of these things with a terrifying calm mirroring the coldness he had shown me when he sent that first text. I had learned the nuances of confrontation from Kichban Ongdad and Mao 1_11.docx, and I applied them now to shatter his confidence entirely. Panic took hold of Corey. He started stuttering, trying to backtrack to explain that the basement renovations were just a precaution for my own safety. He claimed he was only doing what Nicole's parents had requested for their medical convenience. He tried to pivot, spinning a new web of deceit, but it was too late. I was not the confused old man he had documented in his forged paperwork. I was the man who had built every wall of that house, and I knew exactly what he was planning to build in my basement. I cut him off mid-sentence. I told him that I was not a patient to be managed, but a father who had been pushed past the point of return. I informed him that the house was gone, the bank accounts were empty, and his future was currently being dismantled by men with sledgehammers. His voice rose to a shrill, desperate pitch, begging for a chance to explain, begging for a lifeline. I did not say another word. I ended the call. I held the phone in my hand for a moment, watching the screen return to the home menu. With a steady hand, I pried the thin tray from the side of the phone and popped the SIM card loose. I dropped the tiny chip into the ceramic cup of half-finished hot coffee sitting on the table. It hissed for a second, then sank into the dark, bitter liquid. The link was gone. The communication line was permanently severed. I leaned back in the lounge chair and watched the activity in the harbor below. I had no son. I had no home. I was finally truly free. 2 hours after my phone sank to the bottom of the coffee cup, a pristine white luxury moving truck turned onto the quiet suburban street of my former estate. The vehicle navigated the wide curve of the neighborhood and backed smoothly into the long paved driveway I had poured and leveled 20 years ago. The heavy air brakes hissed as the truck came to a complete stop. The passenger doors of the accompanying silver luxury sedan opened and Nicole's parents stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. Her father, Richard, wore an expensive golf polo and tailored slacks, projecting the manufactured confidence of a man who believed he had just inherited a kingdom. His wife, Brenda, adjusted her designer sunglasses and looked up at the sprawling four-bedroom house with an expression of absolute, unearned ownership. They opened the trunk of their sedan and began pulling out matching leather suitcases. They did not look like people arriving for a temporary visit to manage medical equipment. They looked like conquering monarchs preparing to occupy a conquered territory. They expected to walk through the front door, drop their luggage in my master bedroom, and spend the next 2 weeks enjoying a free suburban fortress while I was supposedly isolated at sea. Richard gestured to the driver of the moving truck, shouting instructions on where to park the heavier crates of furniture they had brought to replace my own. He pointed toward the large bay windows of the living room, dictating how they would rearrange the space to suit their tastes. They moved with a sickening level of comfort, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. They assumed my house was an empty vessel waiting for them to claim it. They had no idea they were walking directly into a demolition zone. As Richard and Brenda dragged their heavy suitcases up the stone walkway, the deafening roar of a commercial diesel engine shattered the quiet neighborhood. A massive yellow excavator rolled off a flatbed trailer parked just out of sight on the adjacent cross street. The machine lumbered toward the property line, its heavy steel treads chewing into the pristine landscaping I had maintained for decades. Nicole's parents froze on the pathway, staring in absolute confusion as a team of 8 men in high-visibility vests and hard hats swarmed the front of the house. Omar's commercial construction crew had arrived precisely on schedule. The lead foreman shouted a command over the roar of the machinery, and 2 workers immediately approached the entrance carrying heavy steel pry bars and reciprocating saws. They did not knock. They drove the pry bars directly into the seams of the custom mahogany double doors I had handcrafted and hung with my own hands. The heavy wood groaned under the immense pressure. With a violent crack, the reinforced hinges sheared off the door frame. The workers kicked the heavy mahogany slabs backward into the foyer, letting them crash onto the Italian tile floor. The destruction of the property began with ruthless, calculated efficiency. A second crew shattered the large bay windows with heavy sledgehammers, clearing the glass to allow a debris chute to be fed directly from the second floor. A thick cloud of drywall dust plumed out of the shattered entrance, coating the manicured lawn and the expensive leather luggage sitting on the walkway. Richard dropped his suitcase, his face twisting from smug entitlement to sheer, unadulterated panic. The fortress they intended to steal was being ripped apart right in front of their eyes, and they had absolutely no power to stop the onslaught. Richard abandoned his luggage and charged toward the front porch, waving his arms frantically to cut through the noise of the grinding machinery. He shouted at the top of his lungs, demanding the foreman halt the destruction immediately. He aggressively claimed legal ownership of the property, insisting that his daughter and son-in-law held the power of attorney over the estate. He threatened to call the police, the mayor, and his private lawyers if the crew did not shut down the excavator and leave the premises. The foreman ignored him completely, communicating with his crew through a series of practiced hand signals. Richard stepped dangerously close to the swinging arc of an iron wrecking bar, his face purple with rage. Before he could scream another threat, a figure stepped out from the swirling cloud of drywall dust emerging from the ruined doorway. Omar stood on the broken threshold, his sharp charcoal suit remaining miraculously clean amidst the chaos. He looked down at Richard with the cold, detached gaze of an apex predator assessing a minor nuisance. Omar reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder. He slowly descended the stone steps, stopping inches from Richard's face. He opened the folder and presented the freshly stamped, legally binding property deed. The document bore the official seal of the county clerk, the irrevocable signatures of the transfer, and the unmistakable logo of Omar's commercial development firm. Omar informed Richard in a low, dangerous tone that he was the sole uncontested owner of the land and the structure sitting upon it. He explained that the building was scheduled for immediate and total leveling to make way for a concrete parking structure. The paper in his hand proved that Richard was laying claim to a ghost. Richard stared at this county seal on the property deed, his eyes frantically scanning the undeniable legal text. His mind refused to process the reality of the document. Driven by the sheer arrogance of his entitlement, he lunged forward, attempting to push past Omar and force his way into the dust-filled foyer of the house. He believed he could physically halt a commercial demolition through pure, arrogant willpower. Omar did not flinch. He simply raised 2 fingers in the air. From the periphery of the property line, 4 massive men wearing black tactical gear and earpieces moved with terrifying synchronization. Omar's private security detail had been standing by, anticipating exactly this type of desperate altercation. The security operatives intercepted Richard before his foot could touch the bottom step of the porch. 2 men stepped seamlessly in front of him, forming a solid wall of muscle and body armor. A 3rd operative positioned himself between the front door and Brenda, who was now screaming hysterically from the walkway. The lead security officer placed a heavy, gloved hand squarely on Richard's chest and delivered a sharp physical shove. The force of the push sent Richard stumbling backward, his expensive golf shoes slipping on the dust-covered stones. He landed awkwardly on the pavement, completely humiliated in front of the demolition crew and the gathering neighborhood onlookers. The security team formed a rigid perimeter across the front of the driveway, physically blocking the entrance to the estate. The lead operative informed Richard and Brenda that they had 60 seconds to collect their belongings and vacate the private construction zone, or they would be forcibly detained for criminal trespassing. Confronted by an impenetrable wall of physical force and undeniable legal authority, the parents retreated to the public sidewalk, dragging their dust-covered suitcases behind them in absolute defeat. Richard scrambled away from the wall of security operatives, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his cellular phone. From the quiet sanctuary of the airport lounge, I watched the entire confrontation unfold through the high-definition security cameras I had installed under the eaves of the house years ago. The audio feed picked up his frantic, breathless voice as he dialed emergency services. He screamed into the receiver, reporting a violent home invasion and an unauthorized demolition in progress at his daughter's property. He demanded an immediate armed response. 10 minutes later, the wail of sirens cut through the grinding roar of the excavator. 2 local patrol cruisers aggressively swerved onto the street, their lights flashing against the thick cloud of drywall dust enveloping the yard. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of their vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They walked into a scene of absolute calculated devastation. The custom mahogany front doors lay splintered on the foyer tiles. A mountain of shattered glass and torn insulation cascaded down the front steps. The heavy diesel engine of the excavator idled loudly, vibrating the pavement beneath their boots. The officers immediately instructed the construction foreman to cut the engines. The sudden silence that fell over the estate was heavier than the noise of the machinery. Richard rushed toward the lead officer, pointing an accusatory finger at Omar and the private security team. He presented himself as the rightful steward of the estate, loudly proclaiming that criminals were destroying a multi-million-dollar property while the true owner was away on vacation. He demanded that Omar and the entire demolition crew be handcuffed and thrown into the back of the patrol cruisers without delay. The lead patrol officer held up a hand ordering Richard to lower his voice and step back. The officer asked for legal identification and proof of ownership to justify the trespassing accusations. Richard practically ripped his leather briefcase open right there on the hood of the silver luxury sedan. He pulled out a thick stack of papers and aggressively shoved them into the officer's chest. It was the fraudulent power of attorney Corey had forged. Richard pointed to the document, claiming it granted his son-in-law absolute control over my assets, my estate, and my personal affairs. He declared that he and his wife were authorized caretakers of the property and that the demolition was an illegal act of vandalism. The officer examined the paperwork, his brow furrowing as he reviewed the signatures and the notarized stamps. For a brief moment, Richard looked triumphant, convinced that his stolen authority was absolute. Omar did not flinch or raise his voice to argue. He calmly stepped out from the shadow of the ruined entryway, holding his own legal dossier. He approached the patrol officers with the measured confidence of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He did not hand over the deed immediately. Instead, he pulled a sleek black business card from his interior jacket pocket and handed it to the lead officer. He instructed the police to call the number printed on the card. He stated it was the direct personal line to Bradley, one of the most ruthless and respected corporate fraud attorneys in the state. Omar explained that the attorney was holding the executed irrevocable transfer documents and would clarify the exact legal standing of the estate. Richard scoffed, calling it a desperate bluff. The lead officer pulled out his department-issued phone and dialed the number on the business card. He placed the call on speakerphone, holding the device up so both Omar and Richard could hear the conversation clearly. Bradley answered on the first ring, his voice projecting the crisp, unyielding authority of a seasoned litigator. The officer identified himself and asked for verification regarding the property currently undergoing demolition. Bradley did not mince his words. He confirmed line by line that the estate had been legally sold to Omar's commercial development firm that very morning in a massive cash transaction. He stated that the transfer was absolute binding and executed by the sole fully competent owner of the property. The officer looked at Richard, then back to the phone, mentioning the power of attorney document Richard had just presented. Bradley's response was swift and lethal. He informed the officers that the document in Richard's hands was a known forgery currently under investigation by federal financial authorities. He explicitly stated that Corey had fabricated the power of attorney to secure fraudulent loans and that any attempt to enforce it constituted a felony offense. He advised the police to confiscate the document as material evidence of wire fraud and elder abuse. The color completely drained from Richard's face. The smug, entitled arrogance he had carried onto my driveway evaporated into pure terror. He realized he was not holding a key to a free luxury estate. He was holding physical proof of a federal crime committed by his son-in-law. The officers exchanged a hard look. They stepped away from Richard, their posture shifting from mediation to enforcement. The illusion of ownership was shattered. The legal trap Corey had built was now closing directly around his own family. The lead officer turned his full attention back to Richard and Brenda. He handed the forged power of attorney back to Richard, warning him that attempting to present falsified legal documents to law enforcement carried severe criminal penalties. The officer pointed a stern finger at the luxury moving truck idling in the driveway and the silver sedan parked aggressively on the curb. He issued a final non-negotiable ultimatum. He informed Nicole's parents that they were actively trespassing on private commercial property. He gave them exactly 5 minutes to remove their vehicles, their luggage, and themselves from the premises. If they remained on the concrete after that time expired, they would be immediately handcuffed, arrested, and processed at the local precinct for criminal trespassing and obstruction of illegal demolition. Brenda let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. The reality of their humiliation finally broke through her entitlement. They were not royalty claiming a castle. They were trespassers being chased off a construction site. Richard did not argue. He did not threaten lawsuits or demand to speak to a supervisor. The sheer weight of the legal threat crushed his remaining defiance. He grabbed Brenda by the arm, dragging her toward the silver sedan. They frantically hurled their matching designer suitcases into the trunk, abandoning their grand plans of suburban luxury. The moving truck driver, recognizing the severity of the police warning, threw the heavy vehicle into reverse and sped out of the driveway. As Richard slammed the driver's side door of his sedan, I watched through the camera feed as Brenda pulled out her phone. Her fingers jabbed wildly at the screen, dialing Nicole's number in an absolute panic. The destruction of their false empire was complete. 2,000 miles away from the shattered remnants of my front doors, Corey stood at the polished marble counter of the luxury cruise terminal. The massive glass windows behind him framed the ocean, but his eyes were entirely locked on the glowing screen of his smartphone. The terminal staff had graciously allowed him 5 minutes to resolve what he arrogantly claimed was a trivial banking error. He opened his financial application to access the home equity line of credit he had fraudulently opened in my name. He intended to transfer the $55,000 directly to the cruise line and board the ship as if nothing had happened. He typed in his credentials with rapid, aggressive taps of his thumb. The screen displayed a loading icon for exactly 3 seconds before flashing a stark red error message. The text boldly stated his access was denied. Corey scoffed out loud, blaming the poor wireless connection inside the massive concrete terminal building. He manually closed the application disconnected from the public network and reopened the banking portal. He typed his password a second time, pressing the keys with mounting frustration. The system did not even bother to load. A secondary notification appeared informing him that the account number he entered no longer existed in the active directory. The equity line he had bled dry to fund his failing business and this extravagant vacation was entirely wiped from his financial portfolio. He tried to refresh the dashboard to view his primary checking and savings accounts. Every single ledger displayed a balance of 0 alongside a severe administrative lock code. The financial fortress he had built upon my stolen signature was collapsing. The terminal staff watched him sweat, their polite smiles hardening into expressions of weary suspicion. Corey stepped away from the check-in counter, his breathing shallow and rapid. He navigated to his contact list and dialed the direct extension of his private banker. He expected an immediate apology and a swift resolution to the software glitch holding his money hostage. The phone rang 6 times before a junior associate finally answered the line. Corey demanded to speak to his primary financial manager, citing his elite client status and threatening to move his portfolio to a competing firm. The associate placed him on a brief hold. When the line reconnected, the senior banker did not offer pleasantries. He spoke with a cold, detached professionalism reserved for corporate liabilities. He informed Corey that his entire financial profile, including all personal and business accounts, was indefinitely frozen. Corey demanded an explanation, his voice cracking under the pressure of the crowded terminal. The banker stated that the Federal Fraud Division had issued a comprehensive lock order earlier that morning. He explained that a corporate attorney named Bradley had submitted a massive, irrefutable dossier directly to the federal authorities. The file contained forensic evidence of wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse regarding a fabricated home equity line of credit. The bank was legally obligated to sever all ties and seize any remaining assets pending a criminal investigation. The banker advised Corey to secure legal representation immediately and formally ended the call. Corey lowered the phone from his ear, the color completely draining from his face. The reality of his situation crushed the air from his lungs. He was not experiencing a technical glitch. He was the prime suspect in a federal criminal conspiracy. He turned around to face his wife holding a useless phone and absolutely no way to pay for their passage. Before Corey could formulate a lie to explain the frozen accounts, a sharp ringtone echoed from Nicole's designer handbag. She pulled out her phone, rolling her eyes in sheer annoyance as she saw her father's name on the screen. She answered the call, fully expecting a minor complaint about the layout of my master bedroom or the temperature of my house. Instead, Richard's frantic, hysterical voice blasted through the receiver loudly enough for bystanders to hear. He screamed that he and Brenda were standing on the sidewalk covered in drywall dust. He detailed how a massive excavator was currently tearing the roof off the estate they intended to occupy. He explained that a private security team had physically blocked them from entering while a corporate developer held a flawless property deed. Nicole stopped breathing. Her perfectly manicured fingers loosened their grip. The heavy, customized luggage she was holding slipped from her hands and crashed loudly against the polished marble floor. The sound echoed through the VIP lounge, drawing the attention of every passenger and security guard in the vicinity. She slowly lowered the phone, her eyes locking onto Corey with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. The realization struck her with the force of a freight train. There was no free house waiting for her parents. There was no inheritance to steal. There was no cruise to board. She marched across the terminal floor, closing the distance between them. She did not care about the audience. She unleashed a torrential scream of rage, verbally eviscerating Corey in the center of the terminal. She accused him of complete incompetence, blaming his stupidity for the loss of the estate, their money, and her family's dignity. The fragile alliance built on mutual greed shattered instantly. The violent public altercation immediately triggered the terminal's security protocols. 2 armed Port Authority officers abandoned their posts at the scanning gates and marched directly toward the screaming couple. The cruise director followed closely behind, gesturing sharply toward the exit doors. Nicole continued to verbally assault Corey, her face contorted in rage while he stood paralyzed by the magnitude of his absolute ruin. The officers stepped between them, raising their hands and ordering them to cease the disturbance immediately. The cruise director informed them that their booking was permanently canceled due to non-payment and their behavior violated the passenger code of conduct. He instructed the guards to remove them from the premises. Corey attempted to argue, raising his voice to demand a fraction of respect. The officers did not hesitate. They grabbed Corey by the arms of his tailored jacket and physically marched him toward the sliding glass exit doors. Another guard directed Nicole to pick up her bags and follow her husband out of the building. The entire VIP lounge watched in silence as the elite entitled couple was forcefully evicted like common trespassers. The automatic doors slid open, releasing them onto the concrete sidewalk just as a heavy, freezing rain began to pour from the darkened sky. Corey frantically pulled every credit card from his leather wallet. He rushed toward a line of waiting taxis attempting to secure a ride back to the airport. He swiped card after card through the payment terminals attached to the cab windows. Every single transaction was violently declined by the federal freeze. The taxi drivers locked their doors and rolled up their windows, refusing to take on passengers without verified funds. Corey and Nicole were left standing entirely alone in the pouring rain, completely destitute and utterly humiliated. The freezing rain soaked through their designer clothing before they even reached the bus stop. Corey and Nicole were forced to endure a humiliating 3-hour journey on public transit just to return to the suburbs. They sat in the back of a crowded, damp municipal bus, surrounded by the reality of the working class they had spent their lives looking down upon. The heater rattled loudly, blowing stale air over Nicole's ruined silk blouse. She stared out the scratched window, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth audibly ground together. Corey stared at the floor, his mind frantically trying to calculate a way out of a mathematical impossibility. His federal accounts were locked. His credit was obliterated. He had absolutely zero leverage left. The bus finally lurched to a halt at the corner of my neighborhood. The rain had subsided into a heavy, suffocating mist. They dragged their waterlogged leather suitcases down the familiar suburban sidewalk. The quiet, manicured street they expected to conquer was filled with the heavy scent of pulverized concrete and shattered timber. Corey accelerated his pace, his wet shoes slapping against the pavement. He turned the corner and froze. The sprawling 4-bedroom estate he had planned to steal was unrecognizable. A massive yellow excavator sat idling on the ruined lawn, its heavy steel claw resting against the shattered framework of the second floor. The custom clay tiles of the roof had been entirely removed, exposing the wooden skeleton of the house to the gray sky. Piles of debris stretched across the driveway where their luxury sedans were supposed to be parked. Nicole dropped her bag into a puddle. She let out a choked guttural sound, watching the rain pour directly into the exposed living room where she had intended to place her imported furniture. A towering chain-link fence now completely surrounded the perimeter of the property, transforming my former home into an impenetrable, restricted commercial demolition zone. Bright orange warning signs were bolted to the steel wire, legally barring unauthorized entry. Corey lunged forward, grabbing the cold metal links with both hands. He shook the fence with the desperate, frantic energy of a cornered animal. The steel rattled loudly against the posts, but the barrier held firm. He screamed Omar's name into the mist, demanding answers, demanding access to a property he falsely believed was his birthright. His voice cracked, echoing hollowly down the suburban street. The commercial construction workers paused their clearing efforts, looking down at the soaked, desperate man from the ruined second-story beams. From the thick cloud of plaster dust settling in the gutted foyer, Omar emerged. He walked with a slow, measured stride, entirely unbothered by Corey's hysterical outburst. He wore his tailored charcoal suit and a yellow hard hat, the ultimate symbol of corporate authority presiding over a controlled destruction. He stepped carefully over the splintered remains of the mahogany front doors and approached the boundary line. He did not yell back. He did not show anger. He carried a single thick legal folder tucked neatly under his arm. Corey pressed his face against the metal mesh, demanding Omar halt the demolition and answer for the destruction of the estate. Omar stopped inches from the opposite side of the fence. He looked at Corey with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a terminal diagnosis. He did not offer an explanation or entertain the delusional demands. Instead, Omar smoothly opened the manila folder and extracted a sealed white envelope. He slid the crisp paper directly through the diamond-shaped gap in the chain-link fence. Corey snatched the envelope from Omar's fingers, tearing the paper open with trembling hands. His eyes darted across the bold, legally binding text printed on the heavy cardstock. It was an immediate, unconditional eviction notice. The document explicitly demanded he vacate his commercial corporate office space within 24 hours. Corey stared at the address, the reality of the text refusing to compute in his panicked brain. He looked up, stammering that his commercial lease was locked into a 5-year contract and could not be terminated. Omar calmly corrected him. He explained that commercial leases change hands when the building ownership changes. Omar's development firm had executed a massive cash buyout of the entire commercial plaza that morning. The acquisition was fully funded by the secure, untraceable trust I had established with Bradley just 24 hours prior. By utilizing my financial backing, Omar was now Corey's direct landlord. The lease agreement Corey had signed contained a standard corporate buyout clause, which Omar had immediately triggered to terminate his tenancy. The paper in Corey's hand was a lawful mandate to clear out his desks, his servers, and his employees by the end of the next business day. Omar informed him that the building was scheduled for an immediate interior renovation, and no unauthorized personnel would be permitted past the lobby. Corey's fabricated medical guardianship scheme had relied entirely on liquidating my assets to keep his failing business afloat. Now, not only was the source of that funding completely vaporized, but the business itself was physically erased from the map. Omar adjusted his hard hat, told Corey he expected the keys left on the reception desk, and turned his back, walking calmly back into the dusty ruins of my former home. The crisp white eviction notice slipped from Corey's fingers and fluttered into the wet mud. He stood perfectly still, rain dripping from his chin, as the totality of his ruin finally settled over him. He was completely homeless. His federal bank accounts were locked under a criminal fraud investigation. His business was evicted, and his reputation in the commercial sector was permanently obliterated. He had bet his entire existence on a ruthless gamble to steal my wealth, and he had lost everything. Nicole stepped forward, her expensive high heels sinking into the wet earth. She stared at the crushed piece of paper in the mud, piecing together the final catastrophic failure of her husband's grand design. She had married Corey for his promised inheritance and his proximity to my assets. Now she was standing on a public sidewalk in the pouring rain, bound to a man facing imminent federal prosecution. Her chest heaved as a primal, unrestrained fury took over. She raised her hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across Corey's face. The sharp crack echoed through the damp air, leaving a stark red handprint on his pale cheek. Corey stumbled backward, clutching his face in shock, but Nicole did not let him speak. She unleashed a venomous tirade, blaming his monumental stupidity and arrogance for destroying their lives. She screamed that he had promised her a luxury estate and a Caribbean cruise, but delivered only humiliation and federal charges. Without taking a single breath, she pointed a trembling finger at his chest and declared the marriage over. She threatened to file for divorce the second she could access a working phone, promising to leave him to face the federal prosecutors entirely alone. She turned on her heel and walked away down the misty street, abandoning him in front of the wreckage of the house he tried to steal. Corey stood alone on the rain-slicked sidewalk, watching Nicole's retreating figure disappear into the gray mist. The cold moisture seeped through the wool of his ruined designer suit, chilling him to the bone. He had lost his wife, his business, his home, and his stolen fortune. But the toxic arrogance that had driven him to betray his father still flickered within his desperate mind. He refused to accept absolute defeat. He convinced himself he could salvage the situation by controlling the narrative. He wiped the rain from his bruised cheek and began the long, agonizing walk to the local police precinct. He rehearsed his final desperate lie with every step. He would play the victim. He would cast his father as a tragic, confused old man and Omar as a ruthless corporate predator. When Corey finally pushed through the heavy glass doors of the police station, he immediately adopted the posture of a frantic, heartbroken son. He approached the heavy wooden desk of the duty sergeant, his voice trembling with manufactured panic. He slammed his wet hands onto the counter, demanding immediate assistance. He reported a severe emergency involving a vulnerable senior citizen. He claimed his father, Tyrone, was missing and suffering from advanced, rapid-onset dementia. Corey spun a frantic tale of corporate exploitation, stating that a predatory real estate developer named Omar had manipulated a mentally incapacitated man into signing away a multi-million-dollar family estate. He pleaded with the officers to issue an immediate alert, insisting that his father was not of sound mind and that the sale of the property was an illegal, coercive scam. He stood dripping on the linoleum floor, praying his performance would force the authorities to halt the demolition and freeze Omar's assets. A seasoned detective emerged from the back hallway holding a blank notepad and a pen. He introduced himself in a low, gravelly voice and escorted Corey into a stark, windowless interview room. The walls were painted a dull, institutional gray, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The detective offered Corey a seat at the scarred metal table and sat opposite him, remaining entirely silent. He did not offer a cup of coffee or a towel to dry off. He simply clicked his pen and instructed Corey to detail exactly what had happened. Corey took a deep breath, misinterpreting the detective's stony silence as sympathetic attention. He leaned forward, weaving a complex, fabricated tragedy. He described Tyrone wandering the neighborhood at night, forgetting the names of his own family members and leaving the gas stove burning for hours. He painted a picture of a man entirely detached from reality, unable to comprehend the most basic financial transactions. Corey claimed the power of attorney he held was a reluctant necessary measure taken purely out of love to protect his father from predators. He lied with reckless abandon, detailing how Omar's commercial firm must have ambushed a confused old man and forced his hand on the property deed. The detective did not interrupt. He did not challenge a single word. He simply let the ink flow across the notepad, transcribing every fabricated detail. Corey's confidence grew with every sentence. He spoke faster, layering falsehood upon falsehood, completely unaware that he was sealing his own fate. He believed he was outsmarting the system, manipulating the law to reclaim his stolen prize. He did not realize the detective was purposefully giving him the rope to hang himself, allowing him to perjure himself completely on an official recorded police statement. Corey finally finished his breathless monologue, leaning back in his metal chair with a heavy theatrical sigh of exhaustion. He waited for the detective to issue an immediate arrest warrant for Omar. Instead, the detective carefully capped his pen and set it down. He reached beneath the table and pulled open a deep metal file drawer. The sharp screech of the metal tracks echoed loudly in the small room. The detective retrieved a thick, heavily stamped manila folder and dropped it squarely onto the center of the table. He opened the cover and slid a crisp, pristine document toward Corey. It was a comprehensive psychological evaluation from 3 independent board-certified medical professionals. The document unequivocally declared Tyrone to be in perfect mental health, exhibiting exceptional cognitive function and absolute financial competency. The dates on the evaluation proved the examination had occurred weeks before the property sale. Corey stared at the undeniable medical seal, the color rapidly draining from his face. Before he could speak, the detective slid a second document out of the folder. It was a formal report from a federal forensic laboratory. The pages detailed a meticulous handwriting analysis of the mortgage documents and the power of attorney Corey had utilized to drain the home equity line of credit. The forensic experts concluded with absolute certainty that Tyrone's signature had been digitally traced and manually forged. The report included high-resolution cross-examinations of the pen strokes, proving the documents were entirely fraudulent. The detective tapped his index finger against the forensic seal. He looked at Corey with a gaze devoid of any pity. The trap Tyrone had meticulously engineered over the past month was now springing shut with lethal precision. The undeniable physical proof of Corey's criminal enterprise was sitting right in front of him. The oppressive silence in the interrogation room stretched until it became unbearable. Corey opened his mouth, desperately searching for a new lie, a loophole, an excuse to explain away the forged signatures and the fake dementia claims. The detective did not let him speak. He stood up, towering over the metal table, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of absolute, unyielding authority. He informed Corey that he was not sitting in that chair to file a missing person report. He had walked directly into an active multi-agency federal and local investigation. The heavy metal door of the interview room suddenly swung open. Two uniformed police officers stepped inside, their expressions grim and strictly professional. They moved flawlessly to either side of Corey's chair, cutting off any possibility of escape. The detective read the charges aloud, his words striking like physical blows. He detailed the counts of severe wire fraud, identity theft, the falsification of legal documents, and felony elder financial abuse. He added that the sworn statement Corey had just provided would now result in additional charges of perjury and filing a false police report. Corey remained frozen, his mind completely incapable of processing the sheer magnitude of his destruction. One of the uniformed officers grabbed Corey's arm, hauling him to his feet without a shred of gentleness. The officer forcefully pulled his arms behind his back. The cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs locked around his wrists with a sharp, terrifying click. The detective recited the Miranda rights with a clinical, rhythmic cadence, advising Corey that everything he had just said would absolutely be used against him in a court of law. Corey was aggressively marched out of the room, his legacy and freedom permanently eradicated by the father he had arrogantly underestimated. Corey sat shivering in the freezing, windowless interrogation room, his ruined designer suit clinging uncomfortably to his damp skin. The heavy steel door remained locked, amplifying the agonizing, unbroken silence of the precinct. The boundless arrogance that had fueled his entire adult life was entirely gone, replaced by the suffocating reality of painted cinder-block walls and a bolted metal table. Through the thick, soundproofed glass of the two-way mirror, he could not see into the adjoining room, but the lead detective made absolutely sure he knew exactly who was sitting in it. The detective stepped into the room, leaning casually against the heavy doorframe, and mentioned that Nicole was currently speaking with federal agents right next door. He explained the mechanics of a federal conspiracy charge with brutal clinical simplicity. The first person to provide a full unredacted confession would receive a recommendation for leniency from the district attorney. The second person would bear the absolute maximum weight of the federal sentencing guidelines. It was the classic prisoner's dilemma executed flawlessly to break his resolve. Corey's eyes darted frantically around the sterile room, searching for a legal escape that simply did not exist. He knew Nicole better than anyone. He knew her loyalty was entirely transactional, bound strictly to the luxury status and financial security he could provide. With those assets completely vaporized, he was nothing more than an anchor pulling her down. The detective let the heavy implication hang in the stale air, allowing Corey's own mounting paranoia to dismantle his mental defenses. He planted the seed that Nicole was already shifting the blame, painting Corey as the sole mastermind. Corey was trapped in a psychological race against his own wife, knowing survival meant utter betrayal. Before Corey could demand a lawyer or attempt to spin a new fabricated web of lies, the detective pulled a digital audio recorder from his jacket pocket. He set it squarely in the center of the scratched metal table and pressed a single button. The room filled with the crisp, undeniable sound of Corey's own voice. It was a recorded phone call from exactly 3 weeks prior, capturing Corey speaking directly to a corrupt medical clerk. In the damning audio, Corey explicitly negotiated the cash price for a backdated, fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, declaring Tyrone mentally unfit. The recording detailed his precise, calculated instructions on how to bypass the standard medical review board and ensure the document looked authentic enough to fool the local county clerk. Corey's voice on the tape was chillingly arrogant, boasting about how easily he was going to strip his father of his autonomy and seize the estate. The color drained completely from Corey's face as the recording ended with a sharp, heavy click. The detective leaned over the table, bringing his face inches from Corey's sweating forehead. He explained that federal authorities had been monitoring his communications ever since Bradley flagged the initial suspicious activity on the property deed. The investigation was not a sudden reaction to the chaotic events at the estate. It was a deeply rooted, meticulously built federal case that had been tracking his every move for a month. Corey realized the sheer, insurmountable scale of the trap he had walked into. His father had not simply outsmarted him, he had legally and systematically annihilated him. The detective methodically listed the felony charges associated with the audio file, including wire fraud, criminal conspiracy, and the falsification of medical records, sealing Corey's fate. In the adjacent interrogation room, a completely different scene was unfolding rapidly. Nicole sat with her arms crossed defensively over her chest, the remnants of her expensive makeup smeared heavily beneath her panicked eyes. Two federal agents sat opposite her quietly stacking a massive mountain of printed bank statements and forged loan applications on the table. The agents did not raise their voices or resort to intimidation. They simply pointed out that her signature was visibly absent from the fraudulent power of attorney, but her personal bank accounts had directly received funds from the stolen equity line. They informed her that acting as an accessory to elder abuse and federal wire fraud carried a devastating mandatory prison term. Confronted with the absolute certainty of incarceration and the total collapse of her luxurious lifestyle, Nicole's fragile loyalty to Corey shattered instantly. She burst into hysterical tears, desperately distancing herself from the man she had married. She launched into a frantic, unprompted confession, vehemently claiming she had absolutely no part in forging Tyrone's signature. She pointed the finger entirely at Corey, painting him as a manipulative tyrant who orchestrated the financial crimes without her explicit consent. To solidify her immunity and prove her cooperation, she offered the agents a horrifying piece of leverage. She detailed the exact blueprints for the basement renovations they had scheduled for the estate. She confessed that Corey had deliberately ordered reinforced steel doors and heavy industrial locks. It was not a medical suite for her aging parents. It was a designed containment cell meant to permanently imprison Tyrone while they drained his remaining assets. Nicole spilled every dark, twisted detail of the conspiracy, throwing her husband under the bus to save herself. The lead detective stepped back into Corey's freezing interrogation room carrying a fresh printed audio transcript and a digital tablet. He did not ask any further questions or offer any deals. He simply placed the tablet on the metal table and tapped the screen. The small room echoed with the frantic, hysterical voice of Nicole. Corey sat perfectly still, his breath catching in his throat as he listened to his wife systematically dismantle his entire life. He heard her explicitly deny any involvement in the forged power of attorney, directly naming him as the sole architect and executor of the massive financial fraud. The final crushing blow came when the audio played her detailed confession regarding the reinforced basement doors. She clearly and precisely outlined their dark plan to lock his father away, ensuring the federal agents understood that Corey was the primary mastermind of the horrific imprisonment scheme. Corey stared blankly at the painted cinder block wall, his breathing shallow and erratic. The woman he had lied for, stolen for, and destroyed his own family for, had just handed him a federal prison sentence without a single second of hesitation. The alliance they had built on shared greed and mutual entitlement dissolved into absolute ruin. He was completely isolated from the world. He had no money, no property, no business, and now he had no wife. The detective turned off the tablet and gathered his files, noting the absolute devastation radiating from Corey's face. He informed the broken man that Nicole's comprehensive confession provided the state with everything they needed to pursue the maximum possible sentence. The betrayal shattered whatever remained of Corey's arrogant facade. He slumped forward against the cold metal table, finally understanding his total defeat. Corey sat in the sterile interrogation room, the echo of Nicole's recorded betrayal ringing in his ears. The absolute devastation quickly hardened into a cold, vindictive rage. If she was willing to send him to a federal penitentiary to save her own skin, he would ensure she did not walk away with a single cent. He lifted his head, his eyes meeting the detective's steady gaze. Corey requested a formal plea arrangement offering a high-value physical asset in exchange for consideration. He detailed the exact location of a hidden biometric safe concealed behind the custom cabinetry in his former corporate office. He explained that while Nicole presented herself as an innocent victim of his financial maneuvering, she was actively managing a shadow ledger of her own. Corey provided the access codes and the combination, stating that the safe contained physical ledgers, bank statements, and offshore credit card bills strictly in Nicole's name. He had discovered these documents months ago and kept them as an insurance policy against her volatile temper. He mapped out exactly how she had bypassed domestic banking regulations to open high-limit accounts in foreign jurisdictions far away from the scrutiny of the Internal Revenue Service. He painted a precise picture of a woman who was not a passive bystander, but a calculated financial predator operating entirely independently of his own fraudulent schemes. The detective listened intently, his pen flying across the notepad. The prisoner's dilemma had worked flawlessly. The fragile marriage had completely disintegrated, transforming the two conspirators into bitter enemies eager to destroy one another. The detective signaled a federal agent standing outside the glass, dispatching a specialized unit to the commercial plaza Omar had just purchased. They were going to secure the safe before the demolition crews cleared the building. Within the hour, a team of federal agents arrived at the gutted remains of Corey's former commercial suite. Guided by Corey's precise instructions, they bypassed the shattered drywall and located the biometric safe perfectly integrated into the floorboards. The technicians breached the lock and extracted a thick stack of pristine financial documents. The ledgers were immediately transported back to the precinct and handed directly to the forensic accounting team. The auditors laid the paperwork across a wide conference table, cross-referencing the offshore statements with the domestic business accounts Corey had previously surrendered. The paper trail revealed a staggering level of systematic embezzlement. The documents proved unequivocally that Nicole had been actively siphoning massive amounts of capital directly from Corey's commercial operating budget for the past 3 years. She had set up a complex series of dummy vendor accounts, diverting corporate funds to pay for the lavish lifestyle her parents enjoyed. The luxury vehicles, the imported furniture, and the extravagant vacations Richard and Brenda constantly boasted about were entirely financed by stolen corporate capital. Nicole had bled her husband's business dry to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth for her family. The auditors traced the flow of money with absolute precision, uncovering a deficit exceeding $250,000. Corey's business had been failing long before he attempted to steal my estate, and the root cause was his own wife's insatiable greed. The detectives brought the thick stack of forensic reports into Nicole's interrogation room. They dropped the offshore credit card statements directly in front of her. The color vanished from her face as she stared at her own signature on the illicit transfers. Her narrative of being a helpless, manipulated spouse instantly crumbled under the undeniable weight of her own documented financial crimes. The federal agents stood over Nicole, watching her eyes dart frantically across the undeniable proof of her shadow accounts. The lead investigator outlined the immediate legal and financial consequences of her actions with a brutal, monotone delivery. He informed her that the federal auditors were officially attaching the entirety of the offshore debt directly to her Social Security number. The $250,000 she had stolen and squandered on her parents was now a registered federal liability. Because the funds were embezzled from a corporate entity currently under federal seizure, the debt was completely immune to bankruptcy protection. The investigator explained that the government would immediately initiate asset forfeiture protocols to recoup the stolen capital. Every single item of value she possessed was now subject to immediate confiscation. Her designer wardrobe, her imported jewelry, the luxury vehicles registered in her name, and every cent resting in her personal checking accounts would be seized by the end of the business day. The agents presented her with a formal notification of asset forfeiture requiring her signature to acknowledge the immediate freeze on her entire domestic and international financial profile. Nicole's hands shook violently as she picked up the pen. The staggering reality of her situation crushed the breath from her lungs. She had betrayed her husband to secure her own financial safety, only to discover that her own greed had already dug a grave she could not escape. She signed the document legally, sealing her own absolute bankruptcy. She possessed no liquid capital, no shelter, and no legal recourse to defend herself. The federal government had systematically dismantled her life, reducing her from an entitled socialite to a destitute suspect drowning in inescapable permanent debt. Her arrogance was utterly extinguished by the cold machinery of federal law. Down the hall, Corey was formally processed through the booking department. The heavy steel door of the holding cell slammed shut, echoing loudly through the concrete corridor. He traded his ruined designer suit for a standard-issue uniform, surrendering his shoelaces, his belt, and the last remaining fragments of his unearned pride. He sat on the rigid metal bench, staring blankly at the cinder-block wall, as the reality of his impending federal trial settled heavily over his shoulders. He had orchestrated his own total destruction. Meanwhile, the lead detective returned to Nicole's interview room. Because her crimes were strictly financial and she was not deemed a flight risk with her assets entirely frozen, she was not immediately remanded into custody. The detective informed her she was free to leave the precinct, though she remained an active target of a federal indictment. An officer escorted her down the long, fluorescent-lit hallway and pushed open the heavy glass exit doors. Nicole stepped out onto the concrete steps of the police station. The freezing rain continued to pour from the darkened sky, soaking her ruined clothing instantly. She had no phone, no credit cards, and absolutely no money to pay for a taxi. Her parents had vanished after being publicly humiliated at the estate, leaving her entirely isolated. She stood alone in the downpour, shivering uncontrollably. The devastating truth washed over her with the freezing rain. She had spent years manipulating my son, draining his business, and scheming to steal my home to secure a life of absolute luxury. Instead, her relentless toxic greed had methodically dismantled every single safeguard she had ever built. She walked down the cold, wet sidewalk into the dark city, carrying nothing but the crushing weight of her own engineered ruin. Corey paced the narrow perimeter of his concrete holding cell, the harsh fluorescent lights amplifying his mounting panic. He had exactly one phone call to secure his temporary freedom before his arraignment. He did not dial Nicole, knowing her allegiance had evaporated the second his bank accounts were frozen. Instead, he reached out to a predatory bail bondsman operating on the fringes of the commercial district. The terms of the bond were absolutely extortionate, requiring Corey to sign away a massive percentage of any future earnings and surrender his passport. He agreed instantly, trading his financial future for a brief taste of liberty. The heavy steel doors of the precinct eventually opened, releasing him into the damp, freezing morning air. He walked out wearing his wrinkled, mud-stained clothing, completely stripped of his former elite status. He immediately found a public payphone down the street and dialed the direct office line of Bradley, the corporate attorney who had engineered his downfall. Corey gripped the plastic receiver with trembling hands. He abandoned his aggressive corporate persona and begged Bradley for a single final favor. He pleaded for a brief meeting with his father, Tyrone. Corey framed his request as the desperate plea of a ruined son seeking to make amends before the federal indictment permanently destroyed his life. He promised to sign any restitution agreements or formal apologies Tyrone demanded in exchange for a recommendation of leniency to the federal prosecutor. Bradley listened with chilling professionalism. He coldly reminded Corey that the federal fraud division dictated the criminal charges, not Tyrone. However, Bradley agreed to relay the message, noting that his client might appreciate the opportunity to witness the final outcome of his meticulously crafted defense. Tyrone agreed to the meeting under his own strict conditions. He selected a quiet working-class diner located on the industrial outskirts of the city, a modest establishment Corey would have previously mocked and actively avoided. Tyrone arrived early and claimed a worn vinyl booth near the back window. The flickering neon sign buzzed softly against the damp gray morning sky. A simple glass of ice water rested on the chipped laminate table in front of him. He sat in perfect stillness, projecting the calm, immovable strength of a man who had weathered a catastrophic storm and emerged completely victorious. The brass bell above the front door chimed sharply, signaling Corey's arrival. The physical transformation of the disgraced businessman was absolutely staggering. The man who had confidently strutted through luxury cruise terminals and elite corporate lobbies was entirely eradicated. Corey looked fundamentally broken. His shoulders were heavily slumped, and his eyes were completely bloodshot from a sleepless night inside a federal holding cell. His posture radiated nothing but sheer, undeniable desperation. He wore the same damp, mud-stained clothing from his humiliating public eviction the previous day. His expensive tailored jacket hung loosely over his defeated frame, and his hair was unkempt and matted to his forehead. He shuffled across the checkered linoleum floor, keeping his gaze firmly glued to his shoes, utterly unable to meet the eyes of the ordinary patrons eating their breakfast. He slid slowly into the booth opposite his father. All of his aggressive corporate arrogance, his venomous entitlement, and his ruthless superiority had been violently stripped away by the crushing weight of his impending federal prosecution. Corey was finally facing the man he had tried to destroy, completely devoid of his expensive armor. Corey did not wait for his father to initiate the conversation. The absolute second he slid into the booth, the tears began to flow. He buried his face in his trembling hands, unleashing a torrent of heavy theatrical sobs explicitly designed to evoke deep paternal sympathy. He cried loudly, ensuring his display of utter defeat was impossible to ignore. When he finally lifted his head, he immediately deployed the exact emotional manipulation that had served him so well throughout his life. He weaponized the concept of family, heavily emphasizing their shared bloodline and the 4 decades of history between them. He brazenly attempted to reframe his massive, meticulously orchestrated federal fraud as a temporary lapse in judgment. He classified his ruthless attempt to steal the estate and imprison his father as a singular, unfortunate mistake driven entirely by the intense financial pressure of his failing commercial business. He begged Tyrone to remember him as an innocent child, pleading for the kind of unconditional blind forgiveness a father is supposed to offer a wayward son. Corey reached across the chipped laminate table, desperately attempting to grasp his father's hand. He promised he would spend the rest of his natural life making amends if Tyrone would simply intervene with the federal prosecutors and request leniency. He swore he had already lost everything, crying that Nicole had abandoned him and left him with nothing but his profound remorse. Tyrone did not flinch. He did not pull his hand away, nor did he offer it. He simply sat back against the vinyl seat watching his son perform. He picked up his glass of ice water and took a slow, measured sip. His expression remained clinically detached, offering absolutely zero comfort or validation. Tyrone carefully set his glass down. The sharp, decisive clink of the heavy glass against the table instantly silenced Corey's frantic sobbing. Tyrone spoke with a voice completely devoid of anger or sorrow, delivering a cold, analytical assessment of his son's actions. He flatly refused to address the emotional pleas or validate the fabricated remorse. Instead, he systematically outlined the exact mathematical calculation of Corey's toxic greed. He detailed how Corey had purposefully valued an extravagant Caribbean cruise, a fleeting social status symbol, and a failing commercial enterprise far above his own father's fundamental right to freedom and security. Tyrone explained the brutal, unforgivable exchange rate Corey had willingly accepted. He had traded 40 years of tireless paternal sacrifice, 40 years of financial support, education, and unwavering loyalty for a few temporary weeks of stolen luxury. Tyrone methodically broke down the undeniable timeline of the betrayal. He noted exactly how Corey had hired corrupt medical professionals, forged federal bank documents, and ordered heavy steel doors for a basement prison cell without exhibiting a single moment of hesitation. Tyrone stated that a singular mistake implies a momentary accidental error, but Corey's actions required weeks of deliberate, malicious engineering. He had actively plotted to strip a supposedly vulnerable elder of his dignity, his home, and his accumulated wealth. Tyrone leaned forward, his voice a quiet, devastating weapon. He informed Corey that the federal prosecutors possessed every piece of forensic evidence required to secure a maximum sentence, and he would not lift a single finger to stop the process. He told Corey that he was no longer looking at his son. He was simply looking at a convicted felon facing the exact consequences of his own calculated greed. Tyrone slid out of the booth, walking away forever. Corey watched his father prepare to slide out of the vinyl booth, panic surging violently in his chest. The reality of a court-appointed public defender and a maximum security federal penitentiary loomed before him like an executioner. He lunged across the chipped laminate table, his muddy hands grasping desperately at the air, begging his father to stop. Corey abandoned all pretense of familial reconciliation and shifted to raw transactional desperation. He pleaded for a minor financial concession, begging for a small, short-term loan, just sufficient to retain a competent, high-powered criminal defense attorney. He promised to sign a binding promissory note with exorbitant interest, swearing he would spend the rest of his natural life working menial jobs to pay back every single cent. He frantically explained that without elite legal representation, the federal prosecutors would easily bury him under decades of mandatory minimum sentencing, ensuring he died in a concrete cell. Tyrone paused, his gaze fixed on his son's trembling, dirt-stained hands. He did not sit back down, nor did he display a shred of pity. Instead, Tyrone reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored coat. He bypassed his checkbook entirely. Tyrone withdrew a thick, heavily sealed envelope made of high-grade, cream-colored parchment. The flap was secured with a dense layer of red wax and heavily stamped with a prominent corporate notary seal. He did not hand it to Corey. He placed it deliberately onto the table, sliding it slowly across the smooth surface until it rested directly in front of his son's cold cup of coffee. Corey stared at the heavy package, his mind racing with frantic, delusional hope that it contained a cashier's check. He wiped his nose on his damp sleeve and reached for the envelope, tearing into the thick paper with ravenous urgency. Corey ripped through the notarized seal, his hands shaking violently as he extracted a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy archival paper. He fully expected a lifeline, a liquid trust deed granting him immediate access to emergency capital to fight his federal charges. Instead, his bloodshot eyes scanned the bold, embossed header, identifying the paperwork as the original finalized draft of his father's legacy will and testament. Corey's brow furrowed in utter confusion, his gaze dropping rapidly to the meticulously detailed financial ledgers attached to the back of the legal mandate. The documents outlined an absolutely massive, untouchable family trust fund completely hidden from all public financial records. The bottom line of the primary ledger displayed an authenticated, verified balance of exactly $8 million. The sheer magnitude of the number forced the remaining breath from Corey's lungs, leaving him dizzy and gasping. He read the accompanying summary, discovering that the immense fortune had not been generated by the suburban estate he had so desperately tried to steal. The wealth was the direct compounded result of Tyrone quietly selling off a series of highly lucrative early commercial ventures decades ago. His father had systematically invested the massive proceeds into heavily guarded, high-yield offshore accounts, allowing the capital to multiply silently over Corey's entire lifetime. Tyrone had actively chosen to live a modest, unassuming existence in the suburbs, while sitting on top of a veritable financial empire. Corey stared at the pristine pages, his brain struggling to reconcile the staggering reality of the wealth resting in his muddy hands. He had risked federal prison, destroyed his marriage, and orchestrated a horrific imprisonment scheme to drain a home equity line of $55,000, while an absolute fortune was waiting for him. Absolute horror completely paralyzed Corey as his eyes tracked the specific stipulations of the heavily armored trust fund. The $8 million had not been allocated for Tyrone's retirement, his medical care, or any personal luxury. The money was explicitly legally designed to bypass the probate courts entirely and pass directly down the bloodline. It was an impenetrable generational safeguard constructed to guarantee the absolute financial security of Corey's future children. Every private school tuition, every elite university degree, and every subsequent business venture his unborn children might ever conceive had been fully funded and protected from any economic downturn. Corey had spent his entire adult life driven by a toxic, insatiable greed, convinced his father was a foolish old man hoarding a minor suburban asset. He realized in a single, agonizing flash of clarity that his father had been silently building an impenetrable fortress of wealth meant solely to bless Corey's lineage. The $55,000 he had fraudulently wired to a luxury cruise line felt like an absolute joke, a sickening insult to the monumental legacy currently resting on the diner table. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as the profound, catastrophic magnitude of his miscalculation crushed him. Before Corey could formulate a single word or utter a sound, Tyrone reached across the chipped laminate surface. He moved with a swift, undeniable authority. Tyrone firmly grasped the thick stack of archival paper and pulled it out of his son's trembling fingers. Corey gasped, his hands instinctively reaching out to claw the pages back, but Tyrone had already folded the document securely into his coat. Corey was left staring at the empty space on the table, feeling the phantom weight of millions slipping permanently out of his grasp. Tyrone stood tall beside the vinyl booth, looking down at the broken, shivering man sitting across the table, and delivered the final, devastating blow. He informed Corey that the document he had just reviewed was utterly obsolete. The signature block at the bottom of the will had been legally voided and heavily redacted exactly 24 hours after Bradley uncovered the fraudulent mortgage application. Tyrone revealed that the $8 million had been completely liquidated from the family trust and instantly transferred into a heavily armored, irrevocable, charitable foundation. The entire generational fortune was now permanently allocated to fully fund a comprehensive trade school scholarship program dedicated to uplifting underprivileged youth in the inner city. Young men and women who possessed the exact work ethic and integrity Corey severely lacked would now build their futures using the wealth Corey had violently thrown away. Tyrone explained that the legal transfer was ironclad, deliberately structured by Bradley's corporate team to ensure that not a single cent could ever be contested, challenged, or reclaimed by any member of the bloodline. Corey slumped forward against the table, pressing his face against the cold laminate as a raw, agonizing sob tore through his throat. The finality of his father's actions was absolute. There would be no bail money, no high-priced defense attorney, and absolutely no inheritance. He had traded a flawless $8 million legacy for a pathetic, fraudulent loan that the federal government had immediately seized. He realized with terrifying clarity that his relentless theft of a microscopic fraction of that wealth had cost him a magnificent generational empire. Tyrone did not offer a final goodbye. He simply turned his back on the weeping felon and walked out the diner door, leaving Corey entirely alone. Tyrone pushed through the heavy glass door of the diner, the rusted bell chiming a final note of closure behind him. The freezing mist had settled into a steady, miserable drizzle, slicking the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. He buttoned his wool coat, his mind entirely clear, unburdened by the emotional wreckage he had just left in the vinyl booth. He walked toward his modest sedan, eager to return to the quiet sanctuary of the life he had fought to protect. Before he could reach into his pocket for his car keys, a sharp, frantic voice cut through the sound of the rain. Nicole stepped out from the shadow of a rusted delivery van. She looked nothing like the polished, entitled socialite who had sneered at him from across his own kitchen table. Her expensive designer trench coat was plastered to her shivering frame, and her perfectly styled hair hung in wet, tangled strands across her face. She had clearly tracked Corey to the diner, waiting like a scavenger for the remnants of the meeting. She stepped directly into Tyrone's path, forcing him to stop just inches from his vehicle. Her eyes were wild, darting around the empty lot before locking onto his face. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless performance. She painted herself as the innocent, manipulated victim of Corey's monstrous ego, claiming she had been entirely blinded by her husband's lies. She begged for Tyrone's sympathy, weaponizing her tears to bridge the immense gap between them. She spun a tragic narrative of a ruined woman cast out into the cold, completely destitute, and desperately needing a financial lifeline to start over. She pleaded for a fraction of his hidden wealth, masking a blatant extortion attempt behind a fragile facade of familial loyalty and manufactured grief. Tyrone did not react to her manufactured tears. He simply stepped to the side, intending to bypass her and unlock his car door. Nicole moved instantly, slamming her wet palms flat against the driver's side window and physically blocking his entry. The desperation in her eyes hardened into a venomous, calculating glare. The facade of the innocent, battered wife evaporated, replaced by the sheer, unadulterated entitlement that had driven her to help orchestrate his downfall. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper, shifting her strategy from pleading to direct blackmail. She stared directly into Tyrone's eyes and delivered her ultimate threat. She declared that she was still legally married to his son, and she held absolute control over any future lineage. She vowed that unless Tyrone transferred a massive, untraceable severance payment into a secure account, she would personally ensure he never laid eyes on any future grandchildren. She promised to erase his legacy entirely, legally barring him from ever participating in the lives of his descendants. When Tyrone remained completely impassive, she escalated her demands. She threatened to drag the family name through the mud, promising to go directly to the local press and the tabloid media. She vowed to spin a scandalous, highly publicized narrative of a greedy, hoarding billionaire who ruthlessly sent his own son to federal prison while leaving his pregnant daughter-in-law starving on the streets. She demanded $2 million to simply walk away and sign a non-disclosure agreement. She pressed her back against the wet metal of the car door, crossing her arms over her chest, fully believing she had finally cornered the old man. She demanded her payout, confident that the threat of public humiliation and generational isolation would force him to surrender his hidden wealth. Tyrone looked at the woman leaning against his car, utterly unimpressed by her desperate threats. He did not raise his voice to argue, nor did he entertain the ridiculous notion of a multi-million-dollar payoff. He calmly reached inside his wool coat, bypassing his car keys entirely. He withdrew a single neatly folded piece of crisp white paper. He did not hand it to Nicole. He simply unfolded the document and held it up, forcing her to read the bold, stark text printed across the page. It was not a legal threat or a draft of a non-disclosure agreement. It was a highly classified, heavily detailed forensic banking trace generated by Bradley's elite financial team. The document meticulously tracked a series of highly sophisticated clandestine wire transfers. The paper displayed the exact routing numbers, the precise timestamps, and the specific IP addresses utilized to authorize the transactions. Nicole's eyes widened as she recognized the international banking codes. The trace mapped out exactly how she had systematically siphoned stolen corporate funds from Corey's commercial operating budget over the past 3 years. The document followed the digital trail, flawlessly proving that she had deliberately bypassed domestic auditing software to funnel hundreds of thousands of dollars straight into a series of hidden offshore accounts. The final destination of the stolen capital was printed clearly at the bottom of the page. The money had been deposited directly into the private high-yield retirement portfolios belonging exclusively to her parents, Richard and Brenda. Tyrone held the undeniable concrete proof of her massive embezzlement operation mere inches from her face. The document shattered her entire narrative of innocence, proving she was not a victim of her husband's crimes, but a highly calculating financial predator who had actively orchestrated her own parallel fraud. Tyrone lowered the forensic document, his expression as unyielding as the concrete beneath their feet. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority cutting through the sound of the freezing rain. He informed Nicole that the unredacted banking trace, along with a comprehensive dossier detailing her parents' fraudulent retirement accounts, was currently sitting on Bradley's desk. He laid out the terms of his own ultimatum with absolute clarity. If Nicole ever attempted to contact him, if she ever spoke his name to a journalist, or if she ever stepped within 50 feet of him or his property again, Bradley was instructed to immediately forward the entire file to the Criminal Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Tyrone explained that federal tax evasion and international wire fraud carried mandatory, decades-long prison sentences. He promised her that the authorities would not stop with her. They would systematically dismantle her parents' lives, seizing their offshore portfolios and prosecuting them for receiving stolen corporate funds. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and stated that she possessed absolutely no leverage, no power, and no future in his orbit. The color completely drained from Nicole's face, leaving her skin a pale, sickly white. The arrogant defiance that had fueled her blackmail attempt evaporated instantly. She realized with crushing certainty that the quiet, unassuming man she had plotted to imprison had entirely outmaneuvered her. She had walked directly into a trap she could not buy or manipulate her way out of. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She slowly stepped away from the car door, taking backward steps into the pouring rain. Tyrone calmly unlocked his vehicle, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. He drove away into the mist, leaving her standing destitute and utterly defeated in the cold, empty parking lot. Corey and Nicole retreated to the only shelter they could secure without a credit check, a crumbling cinderblock motel situated on the grimy fringe of the city's industrial district. The room smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap industrial bleach, a stark, nauseating contrast to the imported lavender diffusers they were accustomed to. Rain lashed violently against the single grime-streaked window overlooking the cracked asphalt parking lot. Nicole stood by the stained glass pane, shivering in her ruined designer trench coat, her mind entirely unable to process the sheer velocity of their downfall. The harsh glare of the motel's flickering neon vacancy sign illuminated her pale, defeated face. The deep mechanical rumble of a heavy diesel engine shattered the oppressive silence of the cramped room. Nicole wiped the condensation from the cold glass and peered out into the darkness. A flatbed tow truck swung aggressively into the parking lot, its amber emergency lights flashing rhythmically through the heavy downpour. Two men in reflective rain gear hopped out of the cab, moving with practiced, ruthless efficiency directly toward her pristine luxury SUV. They did not knock on the motel door or ask for the keys. They simply dropped to the wet pavement and attached heavy steel chains to the front axle of the vehicle. Nicole pressed her hands against the window pane, a choked, guttural sob escaping her throat. She watched helplessly as the hydraulic winch screamed into action, dragging the $100,000 symbol of her manufactured elite status onto the slanted steel bed. The federal asset forfeiture protocols Tyrone had explicitly warned her about were executing with terrifying speed. The agents secured the tires, climbed back into the cab, and drove away into the stormy night. The parking space was left entirely empty, perfectly mirroring the sudden, inescapable void of her financial existence. Corey sat heavily on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring blankly at the stained carpet beneath his mud-caked shoes. The absolute suffocating silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sharp, repetitive chiming of his smartphone. A relentless cascade of digital notifications flooded his locked screen, vibrating harshly against the cheap wooden nightstand. He picked up the device with trembling hands, his bloodshot eyes scanning the incoming messages. The local news outlets had apparently caught wind of the dramatic federal raid on his commercial plaza. The resulting public scandal was spreading through their affluent social circles like a devastating wildfire. An email from the executive board of his highly prestigious private country club topped the list. The message bypassed all standard corporate pleasantries, delivering a swift and brutal formal expulsion. The board explicitly cited the impending federal fraud indictment, stating that Corey's criminal exposure violated their strict morality clause and severely damaged the club's elite reputation. His membership was revoked instantly, completely, barring him from the manicured golf courses and luxury networking galas he utilized to project his counterfeit success. The notifications continued to flood the glowing screen without an ounce of mercy. The Regional Real Estate Development Association, the very foundation of his professional network, sent a similarly ruthless mandate. They permanently stripped him of his executive standing and forcefully demanded he immediately cease using their corporate seal on any of his remaining business materials. Colleagues he had spent years aggressively trying to impress were actively and publicly distancing themselves from his radioactive profile. Every organization, charity board, and exclusive syndicate he had bought his way into was actively severing ties. He was being methodically erased from the upper echelon of society. Corey dropped the phone onto the bed, realizing his meticulously cultivated reputation had been utterly reduced to a toxic, unforgivable punchline. Desperation completely overshadowed Nicole's lingering pride. She turned away from the rain-slicked window and lunged for her own phone, her manicured fingers flying across the cracked glass screen. She navigated to her extensive contact list, desperately searching for a lifeline among the wealthy socialites she had spent years aggressively courting. She dialed the private number of her closest confidant, a woman with whom she had shared weekly mimosa brunches and luxury shopping sprees. The line rang twice before clicking directly to an automated voicemail system. Nicole left a frantic, breathless message begging for a temporary loan and a safe place to stay just for a few nights to escape the dingy motel. She ended the call and dialed the next number on her favorites list. This call did not even ring. It disconnected instantly, a clear and undeniable indication that her number had been actively blocked by the recipient. The brutal reality of her social standing began to rapidly set in. She sent out a mass text message to a dozen women she considered her exclusive inner circle, pleading for basic financial assistance. She watched the delivery receipts populate on the screen with mounting dread. The read notifications appeared one by one, immediately followed by absolute crushing silence. Not a single person offered a shred of sympathy. Not one former friend extended a helping hand or a spare bedroom. The people she had desperately tried to impress with stolen wealth cared exclusively about the wealthy facade, not the woman beneath it. The minute her federal asset seizure became public knowledge, her social currency dropped to absolute zero. She was an instant pariah. Her glamorous social circle operated with the exact same ruthless transactional greed she had utilized to manipulate her father-in-law. The high society world she had sacrificed her morality to enter had decisively shut its doors, locking her outside. The digital screen of Nicole's phone finally faded to black, perfectly mirroring the complete darkness that had engulfed their futures. She let the useless device slip from her trembling hand, watching it bounce softly against the stained motel carpet. She slowly turned to face Corey, who remained completely paralyzed on the edge of the sagging mattress, his head buried deep in his muddy hands. The heavy, suffocating silence of the tiny cinder-block room pressed in on them from all sides. There were no more elaborate lies to spin, no more corporate loopholes to exploit, and absolutely no one left in the world to manipulate. The sprawling, majestic estate they had aggressively plotted to steal was now nothing more than a bitter memory firmly secured behind a commercial demolition fence. The luxury vehicles, the offshore bank accounts, and the elite country club memberships had all been aggressively stripped away by the uncompromising machinery of federal justice. They were left standing in a cold, decaying room with absolutely nothing but the damp, ruined designer clothing they were currently wearing. The total, devastating isolation they had callously designed for Tyrone, the dark, reinforced basement prison they had explicitly planned to lock him inside, had manifested as their own permanent reality. They had willingly traded away their freedom, their family, and their fundamental human decency for a hollow, fleeting illusion of wealth. Their unyielding vanity and boundless arrogance had engineered a flawless, inescapable trap of their own making. The chilling rain outside the window continued to blanket the desolate industrial parking lot, sealing them away from the world they once sought to conquer. They were entirely destitute, facing impending federal prison sentences and insurmountable financial ruin. Corey and Nicole sat in the shadowy, claustrophobic confines of the cheap motel, finally forced to confront the undeniable truth that their monumental greed had ultimately cost them everything. Tyrone sat in the deep leather chair opposite Bradley's expansive mahogany desk, the heavy silence of the corporate law office offering a stark contrast to the chaos he had recently navigated. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows sharp and unforgiving. Bradley pushed a meticulously organized stack of thick, legal-sized documents across the polished wood surface. These were the final closing parameters for Tyrone's entire domestic estate. Tyrone picked up the heavy brass fountain pen, his hand remarkably steady, and began to sign his name precisely where indicated by the small red markers. Each stroke of the pen represented an ironclad lock snapping into place. Bradley explained the architecture of the newly finalized trusts with clinical precision. Every single domestic asset from the suburban property Corey had attempted to steal to the minor investment portfolios Tyrone maintained for daily living expenses was now perfectly shielded beneath layers of impenetrable corporate armor. The legal structure was completely insulated against any future claims, familial disputes, or civil litigation. Bradley had methodically anticipated every conceivable angle of attack, permanently closing every legal loophole that a desperate relative or ambitious creditor might attempt to exploit. Tyrone did not rush the process. He read the summary pages with quiet focus, acknowledging the absolute finality of the transaction. The wealth he had accumulated through decades of relentless labor and disciplined sacrifice was no longer vulnerable to the toxic greed of his bloodline. By the time he placed the cap back onto the fountain pen, his estate was a fortress. The legal barrier was absolute, ensuring that his resources would only serve the philanthropic purposes he had explicitly designated, forever out of reach from those who sought to destroy him. Bradley gathered the signed documents, tapping the thick edges against the mahogany desk to align them perfectly before slipping them into a secured leather portfolio. He then retrieved a much thinner, starkly white folder from his top drawer. He did not pass this folder across the desk. Instead, he opened it and rested his hands flat against the margins, his demeanor shifting from advisory to strictly informative. Bradley delivered the final legal briefing regarding the criminal fallout of the Commercial Plaza incident. He confirmed that the state and federal prosecutors were moving forward aggressively with a comprehensive slate of felony fraud charges against Corey. The forensic evidence extracted from the biometric safe, combined with the heavily documented trail of forged mortgage applications and illicit offshore transfers, had completely eliminated any possibility of a plea bargain. The prosecuting attorneys were treating the case as a textbook example of systematic elder abuse and corporate embezzlement. Bradley outlined the severity of the impending legal battle, noting that the sheer volume of undeniable digital evidence guaranteed a swift and brutal conviction. He informed Tyrone that the official trial date was formally set on the judicial calendar for early next month. Corey was entirely out of options, completely stripped of his assets, and facing a mandatory minimum sentence that would effectively consume the remainder of his adult life. The intricate web of lies, extortion, and entitlement that Corey and Nicole had ruthlessly woven had collapsed into a tightly constructed legal cage. Bradley closed the white folder, resting his gaze on his client, waiting for a reaction to the news that the architect of his attempted ruin was now officially bound for a maximum security penitentiary. Tyrone absorbed the severe details of the impending trial without a single shift in his expression. He simply offered a brief, decisive nod of acknowledgement. When Bradley extended the white folder across the desk, offering the complete transcripts of the prosecution's strategy and the specific timeline of the court proceedings, Tyrone raised a single hand to stop him. He flatly refused to read the granular details of his son's destruction. The mechanics of the criminal justice system were no longer his concern. He had already witnessed the magnitude of Corey's greed and the pathetic reality of his downfall in that dingy diner. Reviewing the legal minutiae of the trial would serve no purpose other than to anchor him to a past he was actively leaving behind. Tyrone looked directly at his attorney and issued his final uncompromising directive. He instructed Bradley to immediately establish a permanent communication blockade. The law firm was mandated to intercept, reject, and completely destroy any future correspondence attempting to reach him from either Corey or Nicole. There would be no forwarded letters from federal prison, no desperate voicemails relayed through legal aids, and absolutely no channels left open for future emotional manipulation. If either of them attempted to bypass the blockade through third-party intermediaries or public appeals, Bradley was authorized to issue immediate cease and desist orders backed by the full weight of the newly established legal trusts. Tyrone demanded an absolute blackout. He was entirely finished engaging with the toxic entities that had masqueraded as his family. Bradley nodded in understanding, writing a brief note on his legal pad to activate the strict screening protocols. The barrier between Tyrone and his former life was now permanent and legally enforced. Tyrone stood from the heavy leather chair, buttoning his wool coat with deliberate, measured movements. He offered his attorney a firm handshake, a quiet acknowledgement of a difficult job executed flawlessly, and walked out of the expansive corner office. He navigated the quiet, carpeted corridors of the law firm and descended the high-speed elevator to the ground-floor lobby. The heavy glass doors slid open automatically, releasing him onto the bustling city sidewalk. Tyrone stepped out into the crisp, freezing air of the mid-morning. The gloomy rain from the previous days had vanished, replaced by a biting, brilliant cold that stung his cheeks and filled his lungs with sharp clarity. He stood near the edge of the curb, watching the relentless flow of metropolitan traffic and the hurried pace of pedestrians moving purposefully through their day. He searched himself for the familiar heavy ache of paternal grief, fully expecting the devastation of losing his only son to finally crush him. Instead, he felt absolutely nothing of the sort. There was no lingering sorrow, no agonizing what-ifs, and entirely zero remorse. What washed over him was an overwhelming, profound sensation of lightness. The toxic, parasitic burden he had carried for decades had been surgically removed. The cancerous anchor of Corey's insatiable greed and Nicole's venomous entitlement had been decisively severed. He was no longer a hostage to familial obligation or a victim waiting to be exploited. He was simply a man entirely in control of his own destiny, holding the keys to an unburdened future. Tyrone adjusted the collar of his coat against the freezing wind, turned his back on the towering legal building, and walked steadily down the bright, bustling avenue into the rest of his life. The vast vaulted ceilings of the International Departure Terminal echoed with the overlapping hum of 1,000 transient conversations and the rhythmic cadence of rolling luggage. Tyrone stood near the towering glass windows, his hands resting casually inside the pockets of his tailored wool coat. The brilliant morning sunlight poured through the pristine panes, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished terrazzo floor. Outside, massive commercial airliners maneuvered across the sprawling tarmac, their silver fuselages catching the golden light as they prepared for global trajectories. He checked the heavy silver watch secured to his wrist. His direct flight to Kyoto was scheduled to begin the boarding process in exactly 30 minutes. He possessed no rigid itinerary, no corporate obligations, and absolutely no return date. The $55,000 Corey had so desperately attempted to siphon for a fleeting, superficial Caribbean vacation had been effortlessly redirected. Tyrone had liquidated that specific account entirely and purchased a limitless, open-ended first-class ticket designed to carry him entirely around the globe. He intended to walk through the ancient bamboo forests of Arashiyama, experience the quiet solitude of the Swiss Alps, and sail across the Mediterranean Sea on his own uncompromising terms. The ticket resting in his breast pocket represented far more than a luxury travel arrangement. It was a tangible declaration of his absolute independence. He watched a massive jet accelerate down the runway and lift smoothly into the clear blue sky, tearing through the cloud cover with effortless power. He felt a profound kinship with the departing aircraft. The heavy, suffocating gravity of his previous existence had been entirely defeated, leaving him suspended in a state of tranquil elevation. He was finally prioritizing his own joy, ready to embrace the vast world waiting for him. A sharp, singular chime from his jacket pocket briefly interrupted his quiet contemplation of the busy runway. Tyrone slowly withdrew his smartphone, the bright digital screen cutting through the serene atmosphere he had deliberately cultivated. A priority notification from Bradley illuminated the display, signaling an unexpected breach of the strict communication blockade they had explicitly established. Tyrone frowned slightly, unlocking the device with a measured, deliberate swipe of his thumb. Bradley had forwarded a newly intercepted communication accompanied by a brief legal disclaimer explaining the necessity of the transmission. It was a direct, unfiltered email originating from the Federal Detention Center's monitored network. The bolded subject line blared across the top of the screen in stark, frantic lettering. It was Corey. The disgraced businessman had somehow bypassed the initial firewall, launching one last, pathetic volley of emotional extortion before his impending trial. The subject line alone was a chaotic, rambling plea for unconditional forgiveness, heavily intertwined with a desperate, transparent demand for emergency legal funding. The preview text visible below the subject line revealed the exact same manipulative tactics Corey had deployed his entire life. The opening sentences were utterly devoid of genuine accountability or remorse for his monumental crimes. Instead, Corey brazenly invoked the memory of Tyrone's late wife, weaponizing the concept of a fractured family to beg for immediate capital to secure a high-powered defense attorney. It was a staggering display of unyielding narcissism, completely ignoring the absolute devastation he had purposefully engineered. The digital message pulsed on the bright screen, practically vibrating with toxic entitlement. Corey still firmly believed that a few frantic, emotionally charged sentences could effortlessly unlock the impenetrable generational wealth Tyrone had rightfully sealed away. The audacity was profoundly staggering, a final testament to his unchangeable nature. Tyrone stared at the harsh digital text, holding the glowing device perfectly still in his steady hand. He allowed his thumb to hover directly over the bolded subject line for a long, quiet moment. He possessed the immediate, unhindered ability to open the message and subject himself to the full, agonizing extent of his son's carefully constructed desperation. He could easily read the frantic justifications, absorb the toxic promises of sudden reform, and allow the manipulative venom to seep back into his consciousness. In decades past, a profound, misguided sense of paternal duty would have compelled him to open the email, read every single twisted justification, and frantically search for a way to absorb the devastating consequences of Corey's actions. The old Tyrone would have sacrificed his own peace to shoulder the heavy burden of a completely unrepentant son. That man no longer existed. Tyrone felt absolutely zero compulsion to consume the toxic narrative Corey was attempting to sell. He recognized the message for exactly what it was, a venomous hook designed solely to drag him back into a dark, suffocating abyss. His thumb shifted slightly to the left, bypassing the message entirely. With a single decisive swipe, he swept the frantic plea directly into the digital trash bin. He did not pause to reconsider the profound finality of his action. He immediately navigated to the system settings and accessed the deleted folders directory. He tapped the command to permanently erase all discarded data, watching the screen flash a brief confirmation graphic. The message, along with every ounce of Corey's desperate manufactured grief, was instantly and irreversibly eradicated from existence. The screen refreshed, returning to a pristine, entirely empty inbox. The silence returned to his mind, bringing unshakable peace. The pristine emptiness of the digital inbox provided a profound, unparalleled sense of closure. Tyrone pressed the side button on the smartphone, holding it down until the system prompt appeared on the glowing display. He authorized the complete shutdown sequence, watching the screen flicker briefly before fading into absolute, lifeless black. The relentless tether to his previous existence was finally severed. He walked purposefully toward a heavy metallic recycling receptacle positioned near the sprawling commercial concourse. He did not hesitate or offer the device a second glance. Tyrone dropped the deactivated smartphone through the narrow slot, listening to the sharp, satisfying clatter as it hit the bottom of the steel container. He was entirely untraceable, completely liberated from the toxic demands and relentless extortion of his past. He turned away from the receptacle and walked back to the polished leather armchair where his luggage awaited. He firmly grasped the thick, burnished handle of his heavy vintage suitcase, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the premium leather against his palm. The automated public address system chimed a melodic sequence, announcing the immediate commencement of first-class boarding for the direct flight to Kyoto. Tyrone adjusted the collar of his tailored wool coat and stepped into the bustling flow of international travelers. He moved with a steady, unhurried grace, completely unburdened by the crushing expectations of an ungrateful bloodline. The phantom weight of endless paternal obligation had been permanently lifted from his broad shoulders. He approached the illuminated boarding gate, handing his pristine ticket to the smiling attendant. He walked down the carpeted jet bridge, stepping onto the aircraft and moving forward into a magnificent, unwritten future entirely of his own making. The societal collapse of his former son was complete, and Tyrone's true journey had officially begun. 2 relentless years had passed since the steel doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut on Corey's former life. A bitter, freezing morning descended upon the city, bringing a biting wind that whipped mercilessly through the towering steel skeletons of the industrial district. The glamorous world of imported suits, vintage wine, and executive boardrooms had been entirely eradicated, replaced by the unforgiving environment of a commercial construction site. Corey stood in the center of a mud-churned loading zone, shivering violently beneath a stained, oversized, high-visibility vest that offered absolutely zero protection against the plunging temperatures. Frost clung to the heavy steel scaffolding rising above him, and the sky remained a bruised, dismal gray. He approached a massive pallet of industrial cement, his breath pluming in thick white clouds against the freezing air. The site foreman shouted a sharp, demanding order over the deafening roar of a nearby diesel generator, pointing a gloved finger at the towering stack of materials. Corey did not argue, complain, or attempt to leverage his way out of the assignment. The toxic arrogance that had once defined his entire existence had been systematically crushed out of him by 24 months of grueling probation and insurmountable court-ordered financial restitution. He bent down, wrapping his stiff, freezing arms around a heavy 80-pound bag of dry cement mix. The coarse paper scratched violently against his skin as he hauled the massive weight against his chest. He staggered forward, his work boots sinking deep into the freezing mud with every agonizing step. The punishing reality of his new existence pressed down on his shoulders with undeniable force. He was no longer a corporate executive orchestrating multi-million-dollar frauds. He was simply an anonymous laborer entirely consumed by the desperate daily struggle for basic survival. Corey heaved the massive bag of cement onto a reinforced wooden platform, a sharp gasp escaping his throat as the heavy impact rattled his spine. He paused for a fraction of a second, stripping off his frayed canvas work gloves to wipe the freezing sweat from his forehead. His hands, once flawlessly manicured to project an illusion of elite corporate power, were now permanently disfigured. Deep, jagged calluses lined his palms, and his knuckles were split and bleeding from the relentless friction of raw industrial materials. Cement dust had settled deep into the cracks of his skin, drawing all the moisture from his hands and leaving them perpetually raw and agonizingly stiff. He looked a full 10 years older than the man who had confidently swaggered into his father's estate demanding the property deeds. Deep lines of permanent exhaustion were etched heavily around his eyes, and his jawline was tight with unspoken regret. The punishing elements and the brutal, unrelenting reality of manual labor had completely hollowed out his face. He bent down to retrieve the next 80-pound bag, his knees trembling violently under the intense physical strain. His lower back screamed in protest, a constant burning agony that served as a daily reminder of the staggering empire he had so foolishly thrown away. He gripped the heavy canvas sack, his muscles burning as he strained to lift the dense material from the frozen pallet. He faltered his boot, slipping on a patch of slick ice, bringing him crashing to his knees in the freezing mud. The heavy bag pinned him to the ground. Corey did not curse or cry out. He simply closed his eyes, completely humbled by the crushing physical gravity of a single dollar earned through honest, agonizing labor. Directly across the heavily trafficked commercial avenue, a sleek black town car idled silently against the frozen curb. The heavy, dark-tinted windows completely concealed the interior, rendering the luxury vehicle an invisible phantom against the backdrop of the noisy construction zone. Tyrone sat in the deep leather of the back seat, the climate-controlled warmth of the cabin offering a stark, absolute contrast to the bitter winter storm raging outside. He rested his hands calmly on his lap, watching the mud-churned loading dock through the thick security glass. His gaze tracked methodically across the frantic movement of the laborers before locking precisely onto the solitary figure struggling in the freezing mud. He watched Corey fall to his knees under the crushing weight of the cement. He observed the slow, agonizing struggle as his son fought to push himself back up his high-visibility vest, stained thick with wet concrete. Tyrone did not feel a sudden surge of paternal panic. He did not experience the desperate immediate urge to leap from the warmth of the town car and rescue his child from the brutal elements. His expression remained entirely unreadable, projecting the calm, immovable discipline of a man who had already buried his ghosts. He watched the heavy, defeated slump of Corey's shoulders and recognized the profound, bone-deep exhaustion radiating from his son's fractured posture. It was an unmistakable physical collapse, the undeniable manifestation of a man completely broken by the sheer unyielding weight of the real world. Tyrone analyzed the scene with clinical detachment. He was witnessing the absolute destruction of the artificial entitlement that had poisoned Corey's mind for decades, watching the brutal machinery of consequence extract its relentless toll. The agonizing physical struggle Tyrone witnessed through the tinted glass was not foreign to him. It was the exact same crushing, unrelenting exhaustion he had personally endured 40 years ago. Tyrone remembered the brutal winter mornings, the cracked skin, and the excruciating muscle fatigue that had served as the very foundation of his sprawling commercial empire. He had built a generational fortune from the freezing mud, sacrificing his own physical comfort to ensure his bloodline would never have to experience that exact brand of suffering. Corey had aggressively mocked that sacrifice, treating the accumulated wealth as an inherent right rather than a privileged inheritance. Tyrone sat in the immaculate silence of the town car, his breathing steady and measured. He did not reach for the door handle. He did not instruct his driver to lower the thick glass window. He offered absolutely zero sign of his presence, refusing to provide even a momentary lifeline to the shivering laborer across the street. There would be no sudden rescue, no secret trust fund unlocked, and no grand reconciliation. Corey was finally learning the true, undeniable cost of a $1 a lesson that could only be taught through the brutal, unforgivable mechanism of manual survival. Tyrone watched as Corey finally managed to heave the heavy sack of cement onto his shoulder, staggering forward into the freezing wind without looking up. The lesson was taking root in the frozen earth. Tyrone leaned back against the premium leather seat, entirely at peace with the harsh reality playing out before him. He raised a single finger, signaling his driver. The sleek black town car pulled smoothly away from the curb, slipping seamlessly into the morning traffic, leaving Corey behind in the cold. The sharp, abrasive voice of the site foreman cut through the freezing industrial air, echoing over the relentless grinding of the diesel generators. He shouted directly at Corey, demanding a faster pace and aggressively criticizing the sluggish movement of the cement bags. A year ago, Corey would have instantly retaliated against such a tone with venomous corporate threats and severe classist insults. He would have weaponized his expensive designer suits and elite job titles to crush anyone who dared speak to him with such raw disrespect. Now Corey did not utter a single word of protest. He did not glare at the foreman or attempt to assert a hollow dominance. He simply tightened his raw, bleeding hands around the rough paper of the next heavy sack and hoisted it against his aching chest. The sprawling, catastrophic machinery of the federal legal system and the crushing weight of insurmountable, lifelong debt had meticulously beaten every ounce of unearned arrogance out of his psyche. He was entirely stripped of the protective financial armor he had ruthlessly stolen from his father. Corey staggered forward under the 80-pound load, his boots slipping in the icy churned mud. He focused exclusively on the agonizing physical mechanics of placing one foot in front of the other. The freezing rain plastered his matted hair against his forehead, obscuring his vision, but he did not stop to wipe it away. He accepted the harsh reprimand with a profound, terrifying submission. The illusion of his superiority was permanently eradicated, leaving behind nothing but a broken laborer bound entirely by the brutal consequences of his own monumental greed. He placed the heavy bag onto the wooden pallet, immediately turning back to face the punishing elements and retrieve the next load without hesitation. From the climate-controlled silence of the idling town car, Tyrone observed the exchange with unwavering focus. He watched his son absorb the foreman's verbal abuse and return immediately to the grueling, repetitive labor. Tyrone did not look away from the harsh reality playing out across the wet asphalt. He silently acknowledged the absolute severity of the punishment Corey was currently enduring. The physical agony, the total social annihilation, and the inescapable federal restitution were brutal, uncompromising consequences that would permanently define the remainder of Corey's natural life. Yet as Tyrone watched the mud-caked figure struggle against the bitter winter wind, he felt an unshakable, profound certainty that this exact devastation was entirely necessary. Shielding Corey from the fallout of his massive corporate fraud would have simply validated his toxic entitlement and funded his relentless greed. By decisively removing the financial safety net and permanently locking away the generational wealth, Tyrone had executed the only strategy capable of breaking his son's destructive cycle. He had actively refused to finance a monster. In a quiet, unspoken revelation, Tyrone understood that by stepping aside and allowing the federal justice system to utterly dismantle Corey's fraudulent empire, he had actually delivered the ultimate paternal intervention. He had saved his son by deliberately allowing him to fall completely into the abyss. The freezing construction site was a harsh, unforgiving classroom, but it was actively teaching Corey the fundamental mechanics of genuine accountability and honest survival. Tyrone observed the agonizing physical toll of that education, recognizing that the deep calluses forming on Corey's hands were the only true assets the disgraced executive possessed left. The absolute ruin of the corporate predator was the required genesis for the creation of a fundamentally humble man. The freezing rain intensified, transforming the active construction zone into a chaotic blur of gray mist and flashing amber safety lights. Tyrone had seen enough. The grueling tableau of his son wrestling heavy cement bags through the icy sludge required no further observation. The undeniable, brutal consequences of Corey's monumental betrayal had been firmly established into the very fabric of his new daily existence. Tyrone raised his right hand and gently tapped his knuckles against the thick, reinforced security glass separating the rear passenger cabin from the driver. The professional chauffeur immediately met Tyrone's gaze through the rear-view mirror, registering the silent command with a swift, respectful nod. The driver seamlessly engaged the transmission, shifting the luxury vehicle out of its idle state. The heavy tires gripped the slick, rain-washed pavement, and the sleek black town car pulled smoothly away from the frozen curb. Tyrone sat back into the plush leather seating, allowing the powerful engine to effortlessly propel him forward into the bustling morning traffic. He did not turn his head to look back through the rear window. He offered absolutely no lingering glances toward the miserable industrial lot or the shivering, defeated laborer trapped within its fences. The physical distance between them expanded rapidly as the vehicle accelerated down the commercial avenue visually and symbolically, leaving the wreckage of the construction site far behind. The grim, oppressive atmosphere of the industrial district quickly faded into the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering glass facades of the thriving metropolitan center. Tyrone maintained his forward-facing posture, deliberately cutting the final fraying psychological tether to the son who had aggressively chosen greed over loyalty. The physical departure was a flawless, undeniable manifestation of his absolute closure. The luxury town car glided seamlessly into the vibrant, beating heart of the bustling city center. Tyrone watched the frantic metropolitan energy unfold through the tinted windows, observing the endless stream of professionals navigating the polished concrete sidewalks. The environment that had previously represented high-stakes corporate warfare and relentless familial extortion now simply registered as a quiet, moving landscape outside his secure sanctuary. He reached into the leather briefcase resting on the seat beside him and withdrew a heavy, beautifully bound hardcover book. He flipped open the pristine pages, immersing himself entirely in a detailed exploration of traditional Japanese architecture. He studied the intricate, harmonious wooden joinery and the perfectly balanced spatial designs of ancient Kyoto temples, actively preparing his mind for the international journey awaiting him at the airport terminal. The chaotic noise of the city traffic was completely muted by the heavily insulated cabin, leaving Tyrone enveloped in an absolute, profound quiet. There were no more fraudulent bank traces to investigate, no more predatory legal maneuvers to counter, and zero emotional ambushes to anticipate. The suffocating burden of defending his life's work against his own bloodline had been permanently eradicated by his meticulous legal strategies. He sat in the warm, comfortable interior, breathing evenly as he turned another crisp page. A deeply rooted, unshakable peace settled firmly across his shoulders. The turbulent warfare that had recently threatened to consume his entire existence was over. He had methodically stripped away the venomous entitlement secured his monumental legacy and reclaimed his absolute freedom without uttering a single word of anger. As the vehicle carried him steadily toward his new global horizon, Tyrone understood that the silent adjustment was finally, flawlessly complete. The ultimate tragedy of boundless greed is that it inevitably destroys the very foundation it seeks to exploit. Corey and Nicole foolishly believed that their manipulative tactics and relentless deceit could secure a lifetime of unearned luxury. Instead, their toxic arrogance dismantled their family, eradicated their wealth, and completely destroyed their freedom. True power does not reside in manipulation or stolen assets. It is built through honest labor, unyielding integrity, and the quiet strength to establish absolute boundaries. Financial independence and deep respect are the ultimate armor against betrayal. Protect your peace, recognize the truth, and never finance your destruction. Did you find this story's conclusion satisfying? Share your thoughts on Tyrone's ultimate decision in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more compelling stories of justice and personal triumph.